14th, 2021 Planning Commission meeting, and welcome back to WebEx. I'd like to ask for patience as we transition back to virtual meetings. There might be slight delays as we transition between speakers, presentations, and participants. If any participants have issues with the technology, please send a message to the moderator, Ray. We have over 10 discussion items on our agenda today, plus 2 committee reports. One item is currently listed under old business and has received staff and applicant presentations and have received public comment previously. One item listed under new business has also previously been heard at a planning commission meeting. Without objection, I'd like to move this item, TC 321, to old business to hear it earlier in the agenda. That would leave 8 items listed under new business. We will hear a full staff and applicant presentation for all of these items. I would ask the commissioners to hold all questions until the conclusion of all presentations and any public comments. Finally, please be recognized by the chairperson before speaking. We start every meeting with an opportunity for the public to comment on an item not contained on the agenda. No one has signed up for public comment today. Moving on to consent. Consent agenda is a list of requests that can be acted upon in one motion. There are 2 items on the consent agenda today. Staff has completed review and has delivered the items to the Planning Commission to be deferred to a future meeting. These items will return on a future agenda to be discussed fully. With that, I would ask for a motion to approve the items on the consent agenda. Commissioner Lampman?
Make a motion to approve the items in the consent agenda.
Second.
Commissioner Lampman has offered a motion to approve, and Commissioner Mann has seconded the motion. Because this is not a final vote, I will ask for a show of hands from all who support the motion. Any opposed? The motion passes unanimously. Moving on to committee reports. The Committee of the Whole discussed 2 cases at the August 26th meeting. Item D.1, text change TC 1921, amends the Unified Development Ordinance to create a process for reviewing and approving development agreements as authorized in 160D Article 10 of the North Carolina General Statutes. The Committee of the Whole voted 6-0 at their August 26th meeting to recommend approval of the draft ordinance. Vice Chair Mann, do you have any additional comment?
No, Chair Fox. I think you hit it on the head. We voted unanimously on that case.
Are there any additional questions or discussion from the commission? Okay. Seeing none, I'd like to entertain a motion. Commissioner Rains?
For TC 921, I move to adopt the proposed consistency statement dated September 14th, 2021, contained in the agenda materials, and recommend approval of the zoning text amendment.
Commissioner Rains has offered a motion to approve TC 1921. Do I have a second? Commissioner O'Haver?
Second.
Okay, is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanitha for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. At the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Get used to this again. How y'all doing? All righty. Commissioner Dartell, how do you vote?
Yes.
Commissioner Bennett? How do you?
Aye.
Commissioner Elder?
Aye.
Fox?
Aye.
Vice Chair Mann?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman, I'm sorry.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver,
Aye.
Commissioner Raines.
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously. Moving on to item D.2 Z6020. This is a request to rezone approximately 7.5 acres from R4 and industrial mixed use 3 stories to commercial mixed use 20 stories urban limited with conditions along various properties on Lake Willow Road, Camel Drive, and South Saunders Street. At the August 26th committee meeting, the committee voted to report the item to the Planning Commission with no recommendation. The applicant has since revised the zoning conditions. I'd like to start with staff summarizing the changes to the conditions.
Good morning. Wait a moment for the slides to come up. If you could go ahead a few slides to the conditions page. As the chair mentioned, the applicant has since revised the zoning conditions. So what is underlined shows what has been added since the August 26th meeting. Conditions 1 through 3 remain unchanged. There was a condition previously number 4 that pertained to the preservation of building facades along South Saunders Street. That condition has been removed. Next slide. And then the 2 conditions regarding a bike share station and public art installation also remain unchanged. And then 2 additional conditions have been added. One pertains to screening of parking structures. The condition specifies certain decorative elements that are permitted and other screening elements that are prohibited. And then the last condition pertains to lighting of parking structures that's internal to the structure. It states that they're visible from the public right of way. And there is additional detail to those 2 conditions included in the packet. Next slide, you'll see the maximum build out under the proposed district does not change with these amendments. Next slide. Nor does the overall consistency finding. The requested district is still inconsistent with the future land use map designation of high density residential. Next slide. Consistent with the urban form map designations on the site. Next slide. And inconsistent overall with the comprehensive plan. Go to the next slide, we can see the consistent policies. There are 2 pages of these. There was one change with the removal of the condition on preservation of facades along South Saunders Street. There was a historic preservation policy that was deemed consistent with that condition. Since it's been removed, that policy has also been removed from the consistency analysis. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, and then the inconsistent policies on the previous slide remain the same as well. And your deadline for action is September 22nd, which does fall before the next regularly scheduled meeting. Happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Ms. Ricco. Vice Chair Mann, do you have any additional comment?
Yeah, I think Commissioner O'Haver and others wanted to see some visuals from the applicant. I was wondering if the applicant had that ready for today. Commissioner O'Haver, do you have any follow-up to what I just mentioned?
No, I was going to ask the same question,
Yeah.
Mr. Mann, so thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Moderator, is the applicant available to show the images that were requested?
Sorry, I was trying to pay attention to some technology issues. What is the item number on that?
Z6020.
And Purdy, I believe. Or Molly Stewart.
Yeah, if Molly Stewart's on, Molly Stewart can, she should be on, be able to address that. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. This is Molly Stewart, Morningstar Law Group. Thank you for letting me get back to addressing that. I did have a few questions and requests from last time. Did you want me to kind of go through all of the responses or just the cross section?
That would be helpful, Ms. Stewart. Please go ahead.
Great. Okay. In that case, I did submit some slides. May be helpful.
We can go ahead and pull those up.
Staff is moving them over right now.
Thank you.
I can begin by noting that as we left the last committee meeting, I did sort of immediately learn that we weren't going to be able to produce the true cross section as quickly as needed. So I've done kind of the second and third next best things. And so you'll see some images, both from Street View as well as the topo of the area. Hopefully.
Hey, Molly, I guess we're having trouble finding them. Do you have them available handy, or can you send them over?
I do. I can
email
them to you. One moment. Okay, I've sent them.
Thank you, everyone on the line, for being patient as we transition to the presentation. If staff would prefer, we could hold this item and come back to it after starting old business.
And that's fine. I just saw that there was an issue receiving them in this email, so I've just resent them again.
Okay.
Chair Fox, in the meantime, I got a message from Commissioner Miller. I think she was left off of the invite. She's on as staff, but has asked if Ray could elevate her to the panelist so she can join the meeting.
Excellent. While we're doing that and we're getting Ms. Stewart's presentation up, what I'm going to recommend we do is move on to the first old business item. Excellent. Welcome and good morning, Commissioner Miller. We have two items on old business. These items have been previously discussed and we have received presentations and heard from the public. For each item, I would ask for a short update from staff focusing on the revisions to the request. The first item is case number Z2421 on Dawson Street. This is a request to rezone approximately 0.82 acres from downtown mixed-use 20-story shopfront to downtown mixed-use 40-story shopfront with conditions. We last saw this case at the August 10th Planning Commission meeting, where we deferred the case to allow for revised conditions to be submitted regarding parking decks. On August 24th, revised conditions were submitted for parking deck lighting and screening. I would ask Matt Clem for a brief update on the request, focusing on new conditions.
As luck would have it, Matt Clem's WebEx just crashed.
The joy of virtual.
He should be back in a moment.
With that, I'd ask if there's any other staff who'd like to walk through any of the revised zoning conditions.
Good morning, Chair Fox and Planning Commission. Sorry, my WebEx just crashed. It will log back in quickly though. So since you last heard this case on August 10th, there have been a number of zoning conditions submitted. This is the first one regarding screening of parking deck structures. You can go to the next slide, please. This condition here, multi-part condition, will control the spillage of light within those structures. Next slide. And that's it. So those two conditions have been submitted. You can go back and look at those if you want. Happy to answer any questions. Worth Mills is here as well with Longleaf Law Partners, if you have any questions for him. That's the update. Yep.
Thank you. We've already heard from the applicant, and I do not believe anyone is signed up to speak on the matter. I'd like to allow now for questions and comments from commissioners. Does anyone have any questions or comments? If so, please be recognized to speak. Seeing no questions, I'd like to entertain a motion. Commissioner O'Haver.
Thank you. I would like to move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated September 14th, 2021, containing the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment Z2421.
I believe you need to state its applicability to the comprehensive plan and state its relevance for the public good.
Okay. Commissioner Raines didn't do that in his motion. He just read the first one, so I thought I could copy him, but I will keep going. After considering the policies, maps, and other materials included as part of the comprehensive plan, determined that the proposed zoning amendment is consistent with the comprehensive plan and the other adopted plans and consistent with the future land use map. The action taken is reasonable and in the public interest to permit additional housing to be built in walkable and transported area of the city. Dense development in the walkable urban area will allow for more people to live with reduced automobile reliance, and the area has very low transportation costs and very high access to jobs.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Haver. Commissioner O'Haver has offered a motion to approve Z2421. Do I have a second? Commissioner Raines?
Second.
Thank you. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanitha for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. At the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Dautell?
Aye.
Commissioner Elder?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman,
Aye.
Vice Chair Mann,
Aye.
Commissioner Miller,
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver,
Aye.
Commissioner Raines.
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously. Commissioner Raines?
Quick procedural question, Chair Fox. I was understanding for the motion to approve, we just need to read the top statement on the attachment, but are you requesting that we do the first paragraph in the statement below as well to cover?
I'm going to defer to Mr. York as he gave me the sign and the question mark at the last motion.
Okay.
No, I think because the consistency statement is included in the agenda packet, if you just read the motion at the top, that's sufficient.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification. All right, I'm going to move on to an item previously listed as new business. That is item F.3 that we're moving to old business, text change TC 321. This text change would amend Part 10 of the Unified Development Ordinance to modify the requirements for the provision of bicycle facilities on all avenue types for new streets except the sensitive area avenue. This change will relocate in-street conventional bike lanes behind the curb. This item was last discussed at our August 10th Planning Commission meeting. Since that time, staff has proposed a series of refinements. I would ask staff for a brief update on the ordinance language.
Good morning, Fontaine Burris with Transportation. Next slide. There's a brief overview of the timeline. This is a recommendation made by BPAC back in 2019. This was last brought to you on August 10th, where the item was held. Since then, staff have had dialogue meetings with members of DSAC, and the deadline for action is September 22nd. Next slide. So just a reminder, the proposed text change will modify all of the avenue cross sections to have behind the curb bikeways. This will create bike facilities that are all ages and abilities. Next slide. The reason for this, the big picture, is when the bike lane is in the street, it stands, as it stands in the city's current avenue cross section, there's an expectation that people riding leave the bike lane at times to either pass, go around obstacles, make turns, etc. However, when these bike lanes provide little or no separation from vehicular traffic, they're not accessible for all ages and abilities. The proposed cross section moves the bike lane out of the street while still providing capacity, speed, comfort, and safety for people on bikes. Next slide. When we last presented to Planning Commission on August 10th, the Commission heard from some members of DSAC and BPAC who encouraged working together to improve the text change. Since then, staff have met with DSAC members of 3 different group meetings and have shared ideas and comments via email and phone from both DSAC and members of BPAC. In addition, staff sought out the feedback from national experts in the area and looked at bikeway design guides from other cities, including Los Angeles, Portland, and Massachusetts. Next slide. There are 6 main areas of adjustments made to the cross-section since the Planning Commission's vote on June 24th. They include reducing the sidewalk maintenance strip, removal of the required utility placement, a wider and more consistent buffer, increased flexibility of buffer material and configuration changes for 2-lane undivided avenue, and a narrowed and consistent median width. I will now go into more detail on the slides and can answer Planning Commission's questions about them. But generally, these changes improve the text change by simplifying, narrowing, and increasing flexibility. The first edit is the reduction of the sidewalks maintenance strip to 1 foot. This is an area of right-of-way behind the sidewalk that facilitates maintenance without needing an easement from private property owners. Reducing the width provides a foot on each side of many of the avenue cross sections in order to provide a bikeway buffer without widening the right-of-way. Next slide. The second edit made was the removal of the required utility easement for 2-lane divided, 4-lane divided, and 6-lane divided avenues. Currently, it is a private utility easement on private property that allows for placement of dry utilities such as fiber optic lines. It exists in the current standards partially to reduce the impact on street trees and can also be used for the placement of streetlights. However, in the proposed cross-section, the bikeway pushes this distance too far from the roadway to be used for streetlights. So instead, the buffer can be used to provide locations for the utilities, which can be placed in the 3.5 foot buffer and under the bike lane. So on the right, you'll see an example. The areas circled in red is where the utilities can go. And in this example, there is also the placement of a street light. Next slide. Where clear zone requires utilities to be pushed further from the street, poles can be placed behind the bikeway in between the street trees. Next slide. The next edit made was the 3.5 foot buffer and materials. The draft of TC3 that Planning Commission saw on June 24th had varying buffers of 1, 2, and 3 feet. After a careful look at national best practices, this buffer was increased to a standard 3.5 feet. With this change, the bike lane does not meander at the driveways. There's a large clear zone for bikes. It matches existing standard details, provides consistency, allows for safe on-street parking, facilitates better intersection treatments, and allows for various materials to be used. Next slide. The biggest change in CC3 is a set of conditions that, if met, allow for developers to shift elements around to meet their development characteristics or unique site conditions. I'm not going to read through them all, but this is a paraphrased list of these conditions. And the main goal of this is to provide some flexibility and allow for creativity in site-specific design while still ensuring that the shifts do not reduce the quality of the bike or pedestrian environment. Next slide. The next edit made was for 2-lane undivided avenue. The additional width for the bike buffer is generally 7 foot additional width right of way needed. For large streets, this resulted in an increased right of way that was small on a proportional basis. However, we found that for the 2-lane undivided avenue, it represented a larger proportional increase with fewer opportunities to reduce the width of other elements. And this was a serious concern that we heard from some of the members of DSAC. So our proposed cross-section is a different configuration that was suggested by a member of DSAC. The proposed cross-section for the 2-lane undivided avenue puts the bike lane behind the planting strip. And given the lower volume, speeds, and smaller percentage of trucks on a 2-lane undivided avenue compared to divided avenues, we felt this configuration was appropriate. It would not be appropriate though for other avenues. This change reduces the right-of-way width by 4 feet, but the one item that still needs to remain is a 5-foot private utility placement easement so that underground utilities can be placed without damaging street trees. Next slide. The final change helps simplify the cross-section and narrows them in many instances. In the current UDO, There are different width specifications for median divided or turn lane divided situations in the 2-lane divided and 3-lane divided parallel parking. There's also a wide 17-foot median specified for the 4-lane parallel parking. Staff recommends simplifying and narrowing all of those to a consistent 12 feet. The median width on 4- and 6-lane divided avenues will need to remain 17 feet because most of those streets are NCDOT maintained, and NCDOT will not allow us to narrow the median. Next slide. This table shows how much the measurements are changing on a percentage basis for each cross section and includes 3 measurements: the total right-of-way width, the total width including utility placement easements, and the curb-to-curb width, which represents the most expensive or full depth construction cross. You'll see that right-of-way width increases somewhat over the majority of them. The full width with easements, most of them decrease, and curb-to-curb overall decreases across all the cross sections. Next slide. This is the same table, but represented in feet for comparison. Next slide. During the process, staff also received feedback about the need to update cross sections for downtown mixed use in main streets to allow for separated bikeways. TC3 was authorized only to amend the cross sections for avenues. How many of our streets in downtown are main streets. So we heard feedback that there was still need to look at main street cross sections. Main streets are also used in other mixed-use districts. The current Main Street cross-section includes parking on both sides of the street, leaving no room for protected bike facilities. In some cases, this is directly in conflict with the long-term bike plan. Examples of where this occurs include Target Street and West Street in downtown, Industrial and Navajo Drive in Midtown, South Saunders between Lake Wheeler and Grissom Street in Carolee. An additional text change for Main Street section could be requested and authorized by council. Next slide. Here are 2 potential examples of changes that can be made to address the issue while staying within the same right-of-way and curb-to-curb width that would replace parking with bike lanes. Next slide. This is the same cross-section, but replacing the painted buffer with a concrete curb. Next slide. That concludes my presentation. I do have detailed slides about each cross-section if needed for discussion. What questions can I answer for the commission?
Thank you. That was excellent. First, I'd like to check in with the commission. We've heard from the public at our previous meetings, and I understand 2 members of the public have signed up to speak in favor, and they are attending again. If there is a desire to hear additional comment, we would need to vote to grant time for all opponents and proponents. By show of hands, who would like to allow additional time? Okay, seeing 4 hands, 5 hands. Okay, thank you. So without objection, I'd like to grant 2 minutes to each speaker if they would still care to comment on the item TC 321.
All right, the first speaker we have is Ann Stoddard.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, Ann, we can.
Great. So I'm here representing the Development Services Advisory Committee, or DSAC, and we are proud to have worked with staff and the bicycling community to improve TC 321 to address the practical issues of implementation that had not been addressed in the original draft. On balance, we support this text change, and I indicated support, but I do have 3 requests for your consideration. So there wasn't any way to say I was, somewhat for, somewhat against. So number one, we strongly disagree with retaining the utility placement easement in the Avenue 2-lane section. As indicated by staff, it's a private easement, but it is a public requirement and increases the size of these sections. It also can, based on my discussions with staff, be placed under the bike lane. So I'd really like to ask the reconsideration of that utility placement easement being considered, being removed, particularly for sections where the setback, the 5-foot setback, is not required by zoning. Number two, we ask that the effective date of the ordinance provide adequate time for development of details for how these new sections allow safe transitions to the currently built infrastructure. Without guidance from staff on transitions, unsafe transitions are inevitable. Think about a street-based bike lane that is transitioning to a property next door to it with this particular section. And so we really need to work with staff to have some safe way to transition. Third, we're asking, our comment was not a lack of a solution for a DX district, as indicated earlier in the presentation, but to have follow-up text change related to all urbanizing areas, not just the DX district. We think CX zonings, urban frontages, as well as main streets and DX should be included in this follow-up work. There are many areas of this city that are urbanizing, and not just the DX district. So I just wanted to clarify where we wanted to be involved and would suggest a follow-up text change. And that's it. So on balance, DSAC is a supporter of this. We'd just like to see a few tweaks before it is passed.
Thank you for your comments.
The second speaker we have is Mary Sell.
Hello. Thanks for the opportunity to address your commission. I'm speaking today in support of Text Change 321, which will provide updates to the cross sections in our UDO to better account for all ages and abilities biking infrastructure. I work for Oaks and Spokes, the local advocacy organization in place to advance a more sustainable and equitable transportation system, and we strongly support these changes being codified. Oaks and Spokes has worked closely with stakeholders and staff to identify where modifications could be made on this text change to best address concerns brought forth from practitioners, and we feel the proposal being presented today mitigates those impacts and brings forward a solution that allows us to adopt a modified policy that advances in all ages and abilities bike network. Specifically, staff have worked extensively with the Development Services Advisory Commission to integrate feedback received and have modified the 2-lane undivided avenue to account for right-of-way considerations. These changes are a compromise we feel allows this text change to move forward with minimal impact. Although we prefer a cross-section where bikes have more separation from pedestrians, staff have incorporated feedback on this option to delineate bikes from pedestrian traffic, which we support. We also support changes made to better account for buffers to traffic in order to increase safety for those on bike, while streamlining the cross-sections to better account for utility placement and provide consistency in corridor implementation. We are encouraged by dialogue looking at our downtown DX district. However, we would recommend tabling that process of discussion to a later date so that the avenue cross sections can proceed forward without further delay. This text change allows for significant progress in reaching our transportation and climate related goals, and we recommend Planning Commission provides approval so that this important text change can move forward and help advance our community's climate related goals for advancing a more sustainable and equitable transportation system. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sell. I'd now like to allow for questions and comments from commissioners. Does anybody have any questions or comments? If so, please be recognized to speak. Commissioner Rains?
Thanks, Chair Fox. I agree that if we could have the utility easement under the bike lane, if that's a possibility as a text change alteration, if we can add that. I'd see if staff have any comments about that. Also, don't know what, it's coming about effective time for developing transitions. I don't know what that would be, how we would write that into the ordinance. If it's 45 days, or I'm not sure what that would be. I'd like to have staff's input on that as well. And something I mentioned during previous committee discussion were intersections, and still not clear how that would work on intersections, whether it's orthogonal and traffic circle. So if staff can kind of elaborate on that as well again, that would help me understand how those would be handled.
Is staff available to answer questions?
Yeah, good morning. It's Daniel King. I can speak a little bit to the utility placement easement piece of the question there, and certainly there are ways that utilities can be placed under the bike lane. Some of the things that have to be taken into account and considered are how utility boxes and repairs to the bike lane when utility cuts are made occur. And so those would have to be handled through details to make sure that that was managed appropriately in order to not create, a bike lane that was uncomfortable to use because of, things in it. I wonder if there's a potential compromise of looking at elimination of the utility placement easement in scenarios where there's a zero setback, but keeping it in places that there is already a setback in place where it wouldn't impact, that, piece of, the development code, so that it could stay out of the bike lane in most scenarios, but have some flexibility for it to be placed under the bike lane in scenarios where, tighter development patterns and zero setbacks might impact that piece of it. I'm happy to answer any other questions if you have them.
Commissioners, do we have any additional questions? Commissioner Elder?
It's not necessarily a question, but I did have a couple of comments. Thank you, Chair Fox. I'm in favor of this to promote sustainable transportation. Struggling with my mute here. And bike safety. I do have some concerns with the utility poles being placed between the trees. Maintaining those without heavy trimming. I think we just need to keep in consideration that those trees need to be planted accordingly. With that in mind, it is possible to do that, I believe, just with overhead lines and trees in between them. That could be an issue. I have some of the same concerns about the utilities, I guess, that staff mentioned with utilities being in that bike lane, just to make sure that it's usable area without excessive closures for repairs, and also that it's not uncomfortable to use because of the vault boxes in the bikeway.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. Just a couple of questions, and I apologize if these have been discussed at previous meetings that I was unable to attend. What is the role of the public in these bike facilities? Do they have some sort of say when a new bike facility is going in, and how does that factor into this? My other question is, this is for new avenues. What about existing avenues? How will they be factored in? Because it seems like there's a potential for some inequality if the new neighborhoods are getting these facilities and the older ones are not.
Is staff available to answer Commissioner Bennett's question?
Ms. Fox, this is Eric Lamb with the city's transportation department. Good morning. Commissioners, to address some of those questions, the role of the public, as we establish development standards for street frontages, there is not opportunity for public comment or public input relative to what the city standards are for the public street frontages. Those are dictated by the classifications that are included in the comprehensive plan. And so, for example, the comprehensive plan says road X is supposed to be a 4-lane divided avenue. So as development comes in sequentially along that street, each development is required to build out its street frontage to that standard. And so the time for public input on what those standards are is now as part of this process, which is what we've been engaging in. But in terms of the application of that on a site-by-site basis, there would not be public input in the same manner that there's not public input on the layout or other design aspects of a site plan, for example. You mentioned that the notion of inequality. This is applied to all new development in terms of as development that meets the criteria for exactions, which is the city's authority to require developers to construct certain things. And I think we've now defined that as tier 3 site plans and certain types of subdivisions. And so these standards would apply on those new developments, irrespective of whether it's a new road construction or it's widening along an existing street. Does that make sense, Ms. Bennett?
Yes, thank you. I think just to follow up with my first question, I understand what you're saying about the role of the public. I think my comment was more related to, I guess, more of a context-sensitive application of the bike lanes. Is it just going to be some general standard? They're all going to look the same regardless of where they are? Or is there some opportunity, I guess that's what I was talking about, for the community to have input in how it looks in their neighborhood?
Not specifically offhand, and I'll defer to Mr. Bowers if he wants to elaborate on that further.
Okay.
In terms of context sensitivity, we always have that option with regards to specific site developments. And if there's things about our standards, for any of our standards, that don't work for a specific site, there are means by which development can seek relief. And so we've tried to build some flexibility into these standards to address certain conditions. But beyond that, the developers always have the ability to go and seek a variance and explain why their condition on the ground doesn't match the application of the standard details that we have. And so that exists for every case today. And I believe as part of that, that is a quasi-judicial process, but the public does have the ability to speak up in those cases.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mr. Lamb.
Mr. Lamb, while we have you on the line, perhaps you could approach it also from a streetscape design perspective. I know we're talking about this right now from the perspective of redevelopment plans and following the code. Could we talk about planning for streetscape design?
I need a little clarification on that, I guess. I mean, in terms of, there's always the ability in the city code now to adopt formal streetscapes. And streetscapes are completely customized street applications that differ from the standards that are in the code. So I'm trying to think of one that's been done recently.
And that might occur during the planning process, an area plan or a corridor plan?
That's right. And those are typically more context sensitive, specific applications along a specific street from point to point.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. I believe Commissioner Rains, part of his question was not answered related to traffic circles and recommended transition times from adoption. Is someone available to speak to that?
I can still speak to both of those items. I believe Mr. Rains was asking about intersection design in general. And this configuration of going to one-way bike lanes that are located behind the curbs allows us to start moving towards the implementation of what are known as protected intersections. And it allows for bicycle turns to be handled more safely at the intersections. It does increase the footprint around the intersections a little bit relative to the where the bike lanes be placed. and some of the controls. We have a pilot project right now that's getting ready to go under construction at the intersection of Reedy Creek Road and Blue Ridge Road. That'll be our first protected intersection. And then this entire concept has been rolled into the Six Forks Road corridor project from Rowan to Lynn Road. So that will include these one-way bike lanes and the protected intersection designs at all the major intersections. So that's our first major foray. We'll be developing standard details to accommodate what Ms. Stoddard was requesting. And in terms of an implementation date, I don't see any reason why we can't have everything in place before the end of the year.
Thank you, sir. Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Miller?
We got this question from someone from the public. Did staff ever consider providing a sort of a phase-in approach with doing some limited number of pilot programs before full implementation?
So, Ms. Miller, we're already doing pilot implementations all over the city. So right now, to separate this from our program, these are development standards that will apply on a development by development basis. It doesn't change our implementation program that we'll still have as part of our capital improvement program and complete streets initiatives to still do projects within the existing footprint of streets. We'll still be doing bike lanes and buffered bike lanes in locations where we have adequate space. But in terms of the pilot for this cross section, it's already been done adjacent to the Art Museum on Blue Ridge Road. Albeit that's a slightly wider section than what we're recommending in these standards today. But we've already conducted that pilot for this type of installation.
Great, thank you. Well, given that and some of the open questions, and our deadline for action is September 22nd, is that right?
Correct.
Then we could either hold it and ask for another extension to keep working on it, or I guess we could vote it out with no recommendation and plus a recommendation that council continue to study some of the issues that we've listed. Does that sound right?
Correct. As an alternate, we can also recommend approval or denial with the recommendation of adding additional items per our discussion today. What is the will of the commission? Commissioner O'Haver?
Yeah, I still have some questions if you could entertain those for just a moment.
Please go ahead.
So I'm going to continue to raise the question about, and I think I've brought it up both times now, about how this is going to be administered. I mean, I'm concerned about the bits and pieces, again, sort of the sidewalk to nowhere issue. And if this is going to be required during site plan, administrative site review on new development, then we're going to have on-street bike lanes connected to off-street bike lanes adjacent to it. So I think I've asked that question. I still have some concerns about that. And outside of the pilot program, maybe Mr. Lamb can comment. I mean, have we literally taken these sections and drawn them throughout a few areas in town? Because I understand Blue Ridge, but you know, there was a lot of land to work with out there. And so I'm just curious if we've actually applied this and feel comfortable that, again, we've built in the flexibility. I'm a little bit concerned. I'm not concerned. I'm confused about the flexibility slide. I'm not sure really how much flexibility that allows, but it sure would be nice to sort of see some evidence that here these are administered in a few parts of town on paper to understand what the impacts are. I agree with Commissioner Elder. I mean, trees and power poles don't work. Those trees are going to be hacked up and cut to pieces, and, you know, no offense to the utility company, but they're typically don't bring the arborists out to deal with the trees. So I do have some concerns about that. The 1 foot maintenance strip that is shown, it's shown like with a different material than sort of the sidewalk. And I guess I'm just asking, is the idea there that that's a different material separating the bike lane from the sidewalk. And my understanding is that's really just for maintenance. So I'm just kind of confused about what that material is, especially if it's thought to be planted. A 1-foot planting strip is going to be dirt and mud. I think those are my comments and questions. So I have a question about how it'll be administered. I'd like to understand, or if we haven't, request that we look at some applications throughout town and understand how the flexibility text that was written in applies to that. I do have concerns about the trees and the power poles, and then I'm curious about the 1-foot maintenance strip.
Mr. Haber, I'll try and address those as best I can. So the bits and pieces approach, as you're describing, is an incremental approach that we currently use for street standards. So for example, we have sections today as development comes in that's required to widen out the street, irrespective of what's in place on either side, that already widens the street out for a bike lane and a sidewalk. And in some cases, those don't have any connectivity to adjacent properties and adjacent previous infrastructure or adjacent absent infrastructure. So it is a piecemeal approach, and that's how we have developed major portions of the city over the years. And we recognize that this is a change in those standards. The last time this type of change was implemented was when bike lanes were added into the code as part of the UDO adoption in 2015. And so that does not substantially change our current business practices for administration. With regards to test applications, no, we have not gone in and drawn these in on other corridors. In fact, if anything, keep in mind that the standards that we're talking about applying here are within a foot or two of existing standards today. So it's not a substantial change from the right-of-way allocation that we currently have for our avenue cross sections. With regards to the trees and the utility pole placement, this was a difficult conversation relative to giving up the utility easement that Ms. Stoddard mentioned in previous comments. That was part of the compromise that we looked at making. I think it's a much easier conversation in areas of new construction where most utility work is undergrounded, but in retrofits of older areas, it may continue to be an issue. There may still need to be some type of utility easement back of sidewalk in certain contexts. That'll be a case-by-case basis. With regards to streetlights, placing streetlights in line with street trees is not an issue for us. We have that in many places around the city, so we don't have any hesitation on that. And then your last question was about the 1-foot buffer between the sidewalk and the bike lane. That point of concern about it being inadequate for growing grass was heard, and the idea of allowing for some type of alternate material was broached, and that's where we talked about some type of paver or whatnot. That is one of those details that we still need to work out per Ms. Stoddard's comments in terms of exactly what that type of material is going to be. But that was an effort on our part to create some differentiation between, and we will still want to maintain separation between the bike facility and the sidewalk. So there's an intentionality there that we need to create some physical separation between those two facilities. But we have some flexibility on what that material can be.
Thank you, Mr. Lamb. Do we have any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Seeing none, I'm going to offer a motion to approve TC 321 as it is reasonable and in the public interest, supported by the comprehensive plan, specifically policies related to creating facilities for all ages, complete street implementation, incorporating bicycle and pedestrian improvements, and promoting multimodal transportation design. Also in this motion is a recommendation for council to consider retaining utility easement in the 2-lane avenue or investigating removing utility easement in situations with the 0 setback, adjusting the effective date to allow for further detail to be developed regarding transitions, and following up on detailed design for the DX or Main Street cross section. I have offered a motion for TC 321. Do I have a second? Commissioner Mann?
Second.
Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. So my concern, I support your motion. I guess my concern is when we've made motions like this before with recommendations attached to them, the recommendations don't always follow through. So I feel like if there are issues that we want worked out, we should try to get them worked out to where we're comfortable and then make the recommendation to council. I mean, I support what you're saying. I just don't think it will necessarily happen that way. It seems like in the past when we've made recommendations, let's say, for example, for approval of something, but with consideration of X, Y, and Z, often what gets done is the Planning Commission unanimously recommends approval of this text change. And that last part doesn't carry with it. And so I'm just concerned that we might make this recommendation with the caveat, and that doesn't go anywhere.
Commissioner Bennett, is your concern that the recommendation will not be relayed to the council, or that the council will not take the recommendation if it is relayed?
That the council will not take the recommendation if it is relayed. And that's their prerogative, certainly. But I mean, if it's our desire that these pieces get discussed, we might want to consider trying to work it out ourselves. I understand there's a timing issue, but if those pieces are important to us, we might want to try to get them worked out before making the recommendation to council.
Mr. York, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I was just going to state one of the issues, Chair Fox, that you mentioned was the effective date. The draft ordinance has a blank for the effective date. That's something the Planning Commission could go ahead and fill in if you wanted. Normally, and staff can correct me, it's a 30 days after adoption. But if we believe a longer, if the commission believes a longer time period is appropriate, you could recommend 45, 60, whatever you think would be appropriate, and go ahead. That aspect could be included in the text change that you're making your recommendation on.
Thank you for that, Mr. York. I'm going to keep the recommendation, leave it up to the city council, and just recommend it's a longer effective date per the original motion. At this point, I'd like to call the vote, acknowledging that some of the pieces have not been worked out. I do believe that we have reached a significant amount of compromise with the number of items that have been discussed to this point. So I'd like to go ahead and call the vote. Chinitha, if you could do a roll call, and at the end, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
I think Commissioner Miller had her hand up.
I just had a quick question. I was wondering if Commissioner Bennett had, I guess we need to vote on this one, but if she was planning to make an alternative motion at the end of this vote if it doesn't pass.
I hadn't thought that far. Aye. It's a wary aye, but aye.
Commissioner Dartell.
Aye.
Commissioner Elder.
Also a wary aye.
Chair Fox.
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman.
Aye.
Vice Chair Mann.
Aye.
Commissioner Miller.
Nay.
Commissioner O'Haver.
I'm also going to vote nay. I think I understand it's just a few feet, but I think there's some pretty major impacts that have not been thought through on this. Maybe they can be worked out during the effective date, but unfortunately, I'm going to vote nay, even though I'm fully in support of this text change.
Commissioner Raines.
I'm gonna vote nay as well, echoing Brian's comments.
The motion passes 6-3.
Thank you. And I just wanted to mention, I'm also in support of this text change on the high level. I just wanted to further signal to council that this was not sort of a unanimous support, that there is some significant concerns left to be considered.
Thank you for that. I believe we can move back to item Z6020, which was on the committee report. We have presentation from Ms. Stewart available.
Yes, thank you, Chair Fox. I understand the slides are now available. Perfect. Okay, so I'll go through these quickly. As I mentioned, the first request that we had from the committee was to bring back a cross section of Lake Wheeler Road to kind of demonstrate how the elevations compare between the park side and the project side. And the short answer here is that there aren't major differences along this stretch of Lake Wheeler Road. There are a couple of small ledges. Next slide, please. Next slide. Some of the larger, this one's covered up with trees, but some of the larger kind of ledges that people are familiar with are a little bit farther, closer to downtown. Next slide, please. And so if you look at the topo map overall, you see that in general, those contours are perpendicular to Lake Wheeler. And so it's not as though one side is dramatically higher or lower than the other. For the most part, you do see those small ledges in certain locations. So hopefully that is sufficient to answer the question. I apologize, we were not able to produce that cross-section quickly enough. Next slide, please. And so the concern there was, of course, in just height and how that compares to the park. And so I did want to just kind of remind the commission that some of the standards that apply anyway under the UDO do address that concern in some ways. There is an automatic step back from the facade of the building over 12 stories, as well as a tower separation. So you don't end up with, I think I've heard it called the cruise liner effect up there along the park. So there is some light and air introduced through that mechanism as well. Next slide, please. We also had questions about trees and screening, and so a couple different answers for that. We looked at what would be anticipated to happen along Lake Wheeler Road, and obviously that's a little bit up in the air, but this is what the street plan calls for today. So a fairly high level of greenery right there along that park edge. And next slide, please. And this is the latest that we've seen as part of the Dick's Edge study, so even greener than what we already have, which is quite generous. And so this is the edge that somewhere between these two images is what we could expect to happen along Lake Wheeler Road in this location. We were asked to consider putting or promising larger street trees on our side. We did look at that and really came back and decided, there's an inverse relationship between the health of those trees and the size at which they're transplanted. And within a couple of years, we think it would be better to have those the trees that went in at the standard caliper and height and let them grow in a healthy way. So, and if you're looking along this edge, there's no lack of greenery. We have a very green street section up against a 300-acre park. Next slide, please. We've also introduced some screening and lighting requirements. This image shows where we are up against a residential district there in the southwest. So where the kind of that R6 is up against the project site. And here we've got a couple of controls. One, like I said, we've introduced those additional screening and lighting requirements. And also the neighborhood transition applies in this location. Next slide, please. And that, as you know, provides for 50 feet with no buildings of any kind, or the main structures, and then another 50 feet with height controls. So 100 feet of protection up against that residential district. Next slide, please. So in summary, getting this park edge right is crucial, and it's crucial for the city, and it's crucial for this project. This is where we need our height. This is where we need to put our dwelling units and our office uses. Next slide, please. Right here, where we can take advantage of downtown, of the BRT, of Dorothea Dix Park. It just seems like a home run to put our major uses here. Next slide, please. So between the step backs, the tower separation requirements, the streetscape requirements, the UDO is up to this challenge. It's actually far more thoughtful and advanced than the sort of development that we actually see along the edges of many of the country's most beloved parks. And so you see on your screen, we've got Central Park, we've got Bryant Park, Maggie Daley Park in Chicago. That's a few different examples. Next slide, please. And these are the edges of some of those parks. As you see, our UDO is far more helpful in blending those edges than what we see, and even the best parks in the country. Up in the top left there, that's Fifth Avenue next to Central Park in New York. The bottom left, that's Bryant Park. And then on the right, that's Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. So as you can see, we've come a long way since those parks were developed, and Raleigh is certainly ahead of the curve in making sure that those edges are welcoming. In conclusion, the proposed rezoning would bring housing, 18-hour activity to the park edge area, and also permit those daytime office uses that can support all day long the kinds of services that will also benefit our park users and our neighborhood residents. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stewart. Do we have any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Seeing none, I'd like to, Commissioner O'Haver.
Yeah, I appreciate Ms. Stewart's presentation. I have a couple of questions. I would like to also point out that the step back standard that was presented as part of a requirement for code can be revised, and an alternate means of compliance can be applied for if it's not written in as a condition, and that happens often. So the fact that the code requires a step back does not mean that that is what's going to necessarily occur along that park edge. So I just wanted to clarify that. I have a question about the picture or the exhibit of the Dick's Edge study, and I guess this is for staff. Is that a mandate or a suggestion, especially since they show a two-way bike lane, which we just had an hour-long discussion about bike lanes? So my question is that edge study going to be a mandate or a recommendation or a suggestion? I just planted a 5-inch caliper tree in my backyard instead of a 3-inch caliper tree. I certainly understand sort of the debate about that. I'm not certain that would be enough for me to make a decision that a smaller tree versus a larger tree would not be warranted as a condition. And I just found it interesting that those pictures of the existing parks really did slam a building right up to the street. And I think that was part of our concerns in the committee was a 20-foot edge both along the park, as well as certainly understanding over time those parcels, I guess, sort of southwest are a few single-family homes. And I think we had some fairly robust and, in my opinion, reasonable concerns and questions about that 20 stories along the edge there. So again, while I'm in support of this rezoning, fully agreeing with Ms. Stewart and understanding that this is where we need development, I'm just not sure I've got enough information to be convinced that 20 stories right along the park edge there is appropriate. So I guess there's really only one question there. That's whether or not the Dick's Edge study is a mandate or a recommendation.
Yeah. So this is Ken Bowers. I believe that the intent is to determine the cross-section from Lake Leo, or have that as an officially adopted cross-section that would have the status of a streetscape plan that would then be enforceable. Transportation staff can chime in if that understanding is incorrect, but I believe that all the time we're spending to settle the issue of the cross-section is with the intention to eventually adopt that. Obviously, the council hasn't acted. The plan is not in front of the council yet, but that is what we're moving towards. I would say on the building massing standards and there is a design alternate available for that mandated 12-story step back. The recent text change, changing the process for design alternates did change the building massing standards significantly. And one of the reasons for that was that I don't believe a single tall tower has ever been approved under the UDO that didn't get an alternate for the step back. To my knowledge, a site plan under the new standard has not been submitted yet. So we don't have any track record on how the new standards will be dealt with. There are findings for that include things such as mitigation of wind impacts and architectural detailing and using a larger setback in lieu of a step back that are somewhat specific, but again, that update to the code is relatively recent.
Commissioner Bennett?
Commissioner Haver, were you done? Were you about to say something?
Well, I just wanted to clarify. So it's going to be mandated. It's going to be written in as a street cross section. Okay, thank you.
Transportation confirms what I just said.
Okay, thank you. I expressed some serious concerns when we first talked about this, so I won't rehash all of those. I remain concerned that even the staff report points out that this is not compatible with the existing development. I remain concerned about potential impacts on the existing neighborhood there that are pointed out in the staff report, likely including traffic noise and light. And I remain concerned that this is going ahead of the official adoption of the Dix Edge study. Until it's adopted, it's not a done deal. And so we can't know if this is consistent with the recommendations coming out of a plan that's not completed yet. But my primary concern is with the impacts on the neighborhood that's there. I understand there is redevelopment going on in the area already, but I don't want to take that for granted and say, well, it's redeveloping, so they're probably not going to be there. I mean, they could be there if we approve development that supported them being there. So I don't want to approve anything that that speeds up the removal of the people that have been there for years.
Thank you, Commissioner Bennett. Commissioner Dautel, I believe I saw your hand.
Yeah, thanks, Chair Fox. I was curious if Commissioner O'Haver made a comment, and I believe it was addressed about the using alternates for not necessarily complying with the step back requirements. I'm curious if we get some clarification about the neighborhood transition and and sort of the enforceability of that. I think, that was, for me personally, my concern was less about the impacts of a tower along Lake Wheeler in terms of being across the street from the road, and more along the lines of maybe what Commissioner Bennett is talking about with the housing along Lake Wheeler that's directly southwest of the site. So I'm curious if maybe staff could clarify the enforcement of the neighborhood transition between this project and those houses.
So the neighborhood transition standards are not, the design alternate process is not available to get relief from those standards. If you needed to get relief from the standards, you would have to get a variance from the Board of Adjustment. You would have to show some hardship with compliance. So it's a different type of standard or different type of relief than the design alternate process. Theoretically harder to get because of the hardship requirement. And that's enforceable like any other code provision of the code. So it doesn't have a special out associated with it in the same way that the massing standards do.
Thank you.
Do we have any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Elder?
Thank you, Chair Fox. I just had a couple of, and I might not be visualizing this well according to my own memory, but if I'm right, there's quite a bit of grade separation between the road there and the land on either side on some parts of Lake Wheeler, which I think in some places can already kind of give it a little bit of a tunnel effect. I guess I was curious if the applicant has any sort of an elevation or an idea of how they plan on handling that grade separation. My thoughts being that if you're roadside and it's a building with height that we're questioning in any way, that the additional grade separation is going to make it seem more extreme.
Is staff available to answer the question? Or the applicant?
Thank you. I'm actually looking into that question right now. I'm not aware that we are far enough ahead to say exactly how that would be treated. We're having some offline discussion and hopefully I'll be able to update you here shortly.
Thank you, Ms. Stewart. In the meantime, I think Commissioner O'Haver might have had a question.
I was just going to mention to Commissioner Elder, I mean, that's sort of why I had requested a cross section to give a little bit of peace of mind about sort of the scale and the context in that location because of the grades. And actually during the committee meeting, I felt like if we could see a cross section, that would probably alleviate some of my concerns about what I just expressed. And so that's my point of, I'm not sure I have enough right now, but so I was just going to make that comment to sort of support your question. That's all.
If I could add to my question too, this might be a slightly easier question to answer. Is the current right-of-way wide enough to accommodate the proposed street sections that are, I guess, in the Dix area plan?
No, it's not. It's a tight fit through there due to some existing utility lines and buildings. So there is some widening that'll be necessary. I cannot remember off the top of my head, and maybe Matt Clem can has it more readily, how much of that's going to occur on the park side and how much of it's going to occur on the private property side. There is a desire, given the width of the cross section and the amount of pedestrian and bicycle amenity that's being provided, I think that a fair amount of that ends up on the park side and it's sort of part of the park infrastructure. But I do believe there's some level of impact on the other side of the street as well, on the private property side. Oh, actually, I'm hearing that all the additional width is on the park side. So.
Thank you. Commissioner O'Haver, did you have an additional follow-up?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Because I'm looking at the cross section that Ms. Stewart shared. Again, I'm trying to get behind this. And to sort of follow up on Commissioner Elder's question, what is the width proposed, or the contemplated width there? We've got separated sidewalks with a fairly large flexible amenity space, a two-way bike lane, green water infrastructure, looks like a fairly wide sidewalk on the opposite side of Lake Wheeler. Again, I'm just concerned about the scale, but I can potentially get behind it if I feel like there's separation there. Do you have an idea of what's contemplated for the width of that right of way? That exhibit doesn't call it out. Guess that's a question.
The width varies somewhat because there's a variable width median. Again, this is a highly customized street section that's responsive to the very peculiar dimensions that are available to fit Lake Wheeler Road there along the Dix Park edge. I can't give you precise dimensions throughout the whole section yet. That level of design in the planning process hasn't been completed. There's also some study that's going on about the intersection treatments that will also impact the final.
Commissioner Lampman?
This is one that I've sat with for a long time as well. And going back to Commissioner Bennett's comments about, the current Dick study, I've struggled with that because I think that the Dick study is underway. And I think that there's really great progress. I've seen a lot of activity, a lot of public meetings going on. And so we just don't know when that's going to be published. I know that there was a lot of concern about traffic in the area, and I do feel like this is a little bit of the cart before the horse, and this almost, not to mix, concepts, but, this could set the stage, and is that what we want? I do wish that the applicant had put together some of the materials that were requested. Being a developer myself, I know that type of work can be done from just, with a civil engineer. I know we don't want to spend too much money, but I think the intent here is the laborious and well done negotiation with all of the current landowners here, including the single family homeowners who also are anticipating, that negotiation to go through. I struggle with this a lot. I wish the applicant had put together some of the materials that were requested, because I do think that they're relatively simple materials to help us visualize this concept. So I'm struggling with that level of commitment to the requests of the commission, which leaves so much ambiguity that it doesn't, from that standpoint, that's what makes it difficult. I don't think I'm saying anything that's different than what others are thinking as well, but I'm just struggling with that concept.
Thank you, commissioners. With that, I might offer a motion which may not be popular. Motion to deny case number Z6020 as it is not reasonable nor in the public interest. I move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated September 14th, 2021, contained in the agenda material, and to recommend denial of the zoning amendment. Do I have a second? Commissioner Bennett?
Second.
Is there any additional conversation or debate on the merits of the motion? Commissioner Lampman?
I just want to make a comment that I believe that is the right motion to make, on my opinion. I do want to vote for this, but that is the right motion to make, in my opinion, for what we've received and what we've been requesting, and how we want to see things going forward as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lampman. Is there any additional comment? I thought I might have seen an additional hand. Commissioner Alder?
Hi, I just was, thank you, Chair Fox. I was just wondering if, I agree with the others in that I'm not against this. I'm maybe gonna not vote for it today. I am curious, if this comes back before us, if we can have some sort of timeline as to, and I understand it will be a projection, as to the widening of the roadway as far as the city's property goes, because of the tunnel kind of the high banks on this roadway. The traffic it's already, I think, a little difficult for residents to move into fast moving traffic on Lake Wheeler Road. And for this to move, I would just be curious about what the plans are and the timeline for the widening of the right of way and the road improvements in conjunction with the timeline of the development of this property.
Thank you, Commissioner Alder. At this point, I'd like to ask Shanita for a roll call of the vote. Commissioner O'Haver.
Sorry, I had raised my hand also with Ms. Elder. I'm going to blow your mind here, Commissioner Fox, but again, I'm in support of this, and I'm not certain why we can't hold this one more round and work with the applicant to get people comfortable versus sending it out in denial. So I'm, again, probably confusing everybody, but I'm going to vote for it because I'm in favor of it. I think we can get there. I just don't think we're there yet. So just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and call the vote, and then I'll clarify some of the timeline associated with this case. Ms. Shanitha?
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Dattel,
Nay.
Commissioner Elder,
Aye.
Chair Fox,
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman,
Aye.
Vice Chairman,
Nay.
Commissioner Miller,
Nay.
Commissioner O'Haver,
Nay.
Commissioner Rains.
Nay.
The motion fails. Those not in support of denial of KC 6220 were 5 versus 4 in support. At this point, we can take an alternate motion. I did want to clarify that I believe our deadline is September 22nd, which does not allow us time to take this at another meeting. There can be a couple of options remaining for us. Someone can make a motion to request additional time. Someone can make a motion to vote this out with no recommendation and have a series of recommendations associated with items that need to be addressed. Commissioner Rains?
Thanks, Chair Fox. I think this is an important case because it'll set a precedent for a lot of the development in this area. I think we need to have more time. So I'd like to move that we add, we keep the case on the docket and add time to allow for further discussion and presentation with recommended materials, including, sorry, this is a long motion, including street sections and or zoning massing models through SketchUp or other means.
Thank you. And if we can also clarify the amount of time, I believe a 60-day might be appropriate. Okay.
Yeah, so for 60 days, I'd like to extend this case.
Okay. Commissioner Rains has made a motion to ask for a 60-day time extension on Z6020. And Commissioner O'Haver, is that a second?
Second.
Okay. I will add Commissioner Mann. I don't know if we can hear you. You're on mute.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. I was just wanting to clarify if the applicant and Ms. Molly Stewart, are they okay with that extension or would they rather it go as it is? I just want to make sure that they would, it's not conflicting with any time constraints that they may have. So I just wanted to check with the applicant and see if this extension would be okay.
Thank you, Commissioner Mann, and we really appreciate that. We were initially on the Planning Commission agenda back in May. We have kind of gone back and forth quite a bit, and unfortunately, we do strongly prefer a vote today. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We do have the motion to ask for the time extension on the table by Commissioner Rains with the second by Commissioner O'Haver. At this point, I'd like to ask for a roll call of the vote. And at the end, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote? I'm sorry.
Sorry, may I ask a question? I have my hand up. So the applicant is saying they don't want to hold for 60 days, but we're going to vote to hold for 60 days, whether to hold it for 60 days?
That is correct. The motion is out and the motion has been seconded.
Okay.
Unless someone offers an alternate motion, we are voting on the motion on the table.
Okay, so nay.
Commissioner Dattel,
Aye.
Commissioner Elder,
Aye.
Chair Fox,
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman,
Aye.
Vice Chair Mann,
Aye.
Commissioner Miller.
I just want to clarify. I'm a little confused. So they said that they did not want to hold it. Did they also say that there might not be changes between now and 60 days from now?
I didn't believe they declared. They stated a preference for being voted out today.
We would not expect to have new changes.
You would not expect to have any changes in the next 60 days?
That's right.
Then I will vote against this request for additional time. Nay.
Commissioner O'Haver,
I believe you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm in an awkward position then. If there's not going to be any changes, what's the point in holding this for 60 days? I mean, the point being, I thought we were trying to work here to get to a solution that could get commissioners comfortable. If we're just going to sit on this thing for 60 days, that makes zero sense. So I guess I assume the intent of Commissioner Raines was that there was going to be some additional conversations and perhaps reach some level of consensus, which is what I was hoping for. So all that being said, now I'm completely backwards. I'm gonna blow everybody's mind again and vote nay on a recommendation that I seconded.
It's almost as if one might have seen the tea leaves and offered a motion for denial previously. Can we keep moving forward with the roll call?
Commissioner Raines,
I'm going to vote aye, but I understand the concerns with the other commissioners voting nay. My intent was that we would have more detailed information from the applicant to discuss. And if that's not the case, so be it. I'm going to still vote aye.
Thank you, Chinita. You may need to assist me here. I believe the motion passed. Those in favor, 6-3.
correct.
Okay. Commissioner Bennett?
Okay, so I don't even know what I want to say. So we just voted to essentially waste time, 60 days, because the applicant has said they're not going to change anything. And I just want to underscore something that I have said before, where it feels like we disproportionately bend over backwards for developers who tell us they're not going to make any changes. And we don't give that same grace to communities who are saying, hey, wait, can we work with this some more? We are disproportionately favoring developers, and that needs to be said. It needs to be acknowledged, and we need to do something about that. I don't think that's, I mean, they told us they're not going to change anything, and we're still giving them the benefit of the doubt to come back in 60 days and tell us what they just told us today. That doesn't make any sense to me.
I'm gonna hold some of these comments if you all can hold those till report of commission members, because this is an issue which might extend beyond this particular case. Okay, without objection, I'd like to move forward in the agenda to the new business items. Item F.1, case number Z3421. This is a request to rezone approximately 0.05 acres from office mixed use 3 stories detached with Oakwood Historic Overlay District to neighborhood mixed use 3 stories detached with Oakwood Historic Overlay District. I would like to start with a staff presentation from Matt Clem.
Good morning, Chair Fox, members of the Planning Commission. Like the chair said, yes, this is a request to rezone 0.05 acres from office mixed use, 3 stories detached HOD, to neighborhood mixed use, 3 stories detached HOD. So just moving one step up the intensity ladder and the zoning designations from OX to NX. The RHDC recommends approval of the case. They reviewed it in June, and there's your deadline, October 9th. If we can go to the next slide. So combination of zoning in the area, mostly mixed use. To the east, you can see R10 zoning, but just on the edge of downtown here, downtown to the left in red in that DX, and then Oakwood to the north, office mixed use, residential mixed use, neighborhood mixed use, and the like. Next slide. Here's an aerial look, looking at a single developed piece of property on Morrison Street. Residential and office development in the area, city cemetery to the east. Next slide. There is the structure there behind the crepe myrtles. Next slide. Pretty minimal changes to the zoning entitlement here. No change in units or density. Office, slight increase, and retail is increased to much larger than what could be built today. Next slide. Higher walk score than average, higher bike score, transit score, lower transportation cost index than average, and a high job proximity than average compared to the city. So no change to housing supply, does not include any subsidized units, but otherwise scores well in terms of affordability analysis. Next slide. Demographic indicators, roughly the same for the area where the site is compared to the city. Next slide. Future land use map recommends neighborhood mixed use on the property. So the request is consistent with the future land use map. Next slide. The site is within a transit station area and is within the core transit area, which would recommend an urban approach to frontage. The request includes a detached frontage, so it is inconsistent with the urban form map. Next slide. There's your consistency analysis. It is inconsistent with the urban form map. Next slide. Consistent policies. You can see these are marked as key policies in the comprehensive plan. Next slide. More consistent policies. Next slide. That is inconsistent with the frontage policy because of the detached frontage in that urban form area. Next slide. There are no outstanding issues. Happy to answer any questions. The applicants are here as well. I know that they don't have a presentation or slides to go through, but I think they have some remarks that they would like to make about the case.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clem. Let's unmute the microphones for the applicant team if they would like to speak in support. The applicant and all those in support of the case have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Can you hear me? This is John Montgomery.
Yes, John, we can hear you.
Thanks. I actually compliment Matt on his presentation. It was very in-depth. I really don't have a lot to add. I'm here to answer any questions that you might have. Probably the main overview of the whole thing is that it is in the historic districts in supervision, and so therefore nothing is going to look any different after we're in, because anything we would change would have to be with them. No plan to make a change that would change the exterior of the building. So I'm here for questions, really.
Thank you, Mr. Montgomery. I believe there is no one else from the public signed up to speak in opposition to this request. Can I get a verification from the moderator?
That's correct.
Okay, so I'd like to allow for questions and comments from the commissioners. Does anyone have any questions or comments? If so, please be recognized.
Chair Fox, this is Matt again. I just want to make one clarifying comment on the request. So the reason, the stated reason by the applicant to rezone the property is that under the existing zoning, the office mixed use zoning, structures, standalone retail is not a permitted use. So in a single structure, you have to have multiple tenants or multiple uses if there's a retail use. So stepping up into the neighborhood mixed use category would allow a single business to occupy the entire structure, which is what the applicants are looking to do. So that is the real purpose of the request. And going to NX would facilitate a single owner operator to utilize the entire structure. So
Thank you for that clarification. Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Seeing none, I'd like to entertain a motion. Commissioner Dattel? You're mute.
I apologize. Thanks. I'd like to make a motion to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated September 14, 2021, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment.
Thank you. Commissioner Dattel has offered a motion. Do we have a second? Commissioner Rains?
Second.
Thank you. Do we have any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanitha for a roll call of the vote.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Dattel?
Aye.
Commissioner Elder?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Vice Chairman?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
I believe she's dropped off.
Thank you. Commissioner O'Haver?
Aye.
Commissioner Rains?
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously. Moving on to item F.2, Comprehensive Plan Amendment CP 521. This is a city-initiated request to amend a portion of the implementation section of the 2030 Comprehensive Plan. This amendment would establish a 10-year review schedule for existing adopted area plans, after which adopted plans would be reviewed for relevancy and may be removed or amended per guidance as described in the backup material. I'd like to ask for a staff presentation from Hannah Recco.
Good morning. So yes, this is CP 521 Area Plan Review. It is a city-initiated request. It would amend Section 17.4 Small Area Studies, which is located in Chapter 17 Implementation. And it would establish a review schedule and criteria to evaluate adopted area plans. Currently, the review of adopted area plans is attached to the review of the whole comprehensive plan. The update, or I'm sorry, previously that was the case with the 2019 update of the 2030 comprehensive plan. The review of updates to the plan were changed from a 5-year review to every 1 or 2 years, doing a review focused on a particular topic. So this request would sort of separate the review of adopted area plans and establish a longer timeline that's more aligned with the implementation of area plans, and also provide additional guidance criteria. Next slide. So the main piece that is changing is policy IM 4.3. You can see in the striked out areas, that's the current language, connects it to updates to the whole plan. The proposed language would adjust that so that there's every 10 years after the adoption of individual plans, they would be re-examined, and there would be an option to either amend or remove them in cases where major changes have made the guidance not really fulfill the intent of the area plan. To support this, there is also additional language in this request. Go to the next slide. Establish the criteria for evaluating those. You can see that here. It includes situations where the action items in a small area study have been largely implemented, or significant development has occurred, or other capital projects identified by the plan have been implemented. Situations where the city council has taken action that is contrary to plan guidance, and that might include numerous rezoning requests or other decisions contrary to plan guidance. And then situations where the trends that informed the original plan have changed substantially or have reversed somehow, or in the case where some other foundational aspect of the plan has changed. Next slide. So the request is consistent with comprehensive plan policy regarding criteria for amendment to the plan. Part of that policy speaks to changes that would support the goals of the comprehensive plan. Small area studies are really designed to address changing trends that are specific to an area, provide long-term, long-range policy guidance, and bring community benefits. So the request would align review of those plans, periodic review more with a timeline for implementation of plans, and help ensure that small area guidance is continuing to support the current conditions in the community and support those goals of small area studies. Next slide. And that is the end of the overview of this request. Deadline for action is in November, and we can answer any other questions you have about it.
Thank you, Ms. Recco. I'd like to announce before we move forward, Commissioner Miller had an emergency and is excused for the rest of the meeting. And Mr. Moderator, can you verify that no one from the public is signed up to speak on this item?
That's correct.
Okay, I'd like to now allow for questions and comments from commissioners. Does anyone have any questions or comments about CP 521? Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. So I'm generally in support of this amendment. My question is under the items that could require, I guess, a review of a small area plan. The one, if there have been numerous rezonings contrary to the area plan, that one kind of gives me pause, because it seems like it almost encourages rebellion. I mean, you don't like the small area plan, so let's just approve a bunch of developments that are inconsistent with it, and we can get the plan kicked out. I mean, the plan goes through a process with the public and staff to get something that reflects the community vision and community priorities. But then you could have somebody else's vision or priorities supersede that simply by just approving some rezonings that go against that vision. I'm not comfortable with that one. Other than that, I'm okay with this amendment.
Thank you. Mr. Bowers, it looks like you were going to make a comment.
Sure. So just to give a little background on this, since the department since the plan was adopted and the department started issuing progress reports, one of the things we look at is cases that are approved that are found to be inconsistent with the plan but are approved anyway. And when our elected body, the city council, takes an action contrary to an adopted plan, it raises the question, is the policy guidance in the plan still valid and there were reasons for this to be an exception? Or does this vote show that the council no longer believes that the policy that it was contradicting was valid or not. And we think that's a question that's worth posing and answering, especially if it's been something that's been done repeatedly. So while I agree with you, the point of an area plan is to give some specific guidance and to have expectations that discretionary decisions like rezoning will give a lot of weight to that policy guidance. If for any reason we find that there's been more than once that policy guidance has been deviated from, it certainly raises the question as to whether or not that guidance is still viewed as valid or needs to be reexamined. That's kind of where staff was coming from in approving and posing that as a criteria, as one of the criteria for evaluation. If we don't have that in there, you still have the possibility that rezoning cases inconsistent with an area plan will be approved, and then what is the proper course of action in that case? How many times does that have to happen before we decide we're not taking our own plan seriously? Maybe we need to revisit its content. I think that's really what our reasoning is. I would also say that any amendment to a plan goes through a process, PC review, city council has to act. In my experience, what's been more common is for plans to be updated. So we had, there have been several area plans that are on the books that have been updated over time. We had a couple old area plans for Cameron Village and the Wade Oberlin area. They were superseded by a new Cameron Village area plan. We had a Falls of News plan that was replaced by an updated Falls of the News plan. It's often a spur to reopen the planning process for the area as opposed to simply amending it without that process or removing it.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Bowers. Does that answer your question and concern, Commissioner Burnett?
It does. I understand where staff is coming from. I guess I'm just a little more cynical, and I just see the opportunity for that one provision to be taken advantage of, especially if it happens once that a rezoning against the small area plan gets approved. Then it seems like it could set a precedent for, well, you know, they approved that one. So if we get a few more in there, then they'll have to reopen that, revisit that plan. And so it's the cynic in me, but I definitely understand where you're coming from. So I appreciate the explanation.
Commissioner Elder?
Thank you, Chair Fox. Mr. Bowers, what typically triggers a revision of the new plan? You mentioned that there's some plans that have been revised. Is there a thing that triggers that, or how does that happen now?
There have been many different things that triggered it. Sometimes a district council member has decided that the plan needs to update and has got other council members to agree to fund that in the budget. Sometimes it's from a citizen petition, and sometimes it's brought forward by staff as something that we feel needs updating. The most recent time was when we did the larger update to the comprehensive plan. There was some consolidation of some overlapping plans out in the Arena and Blue Ridge Road area that kind of combined them and consolidated much of the policy guidance, and also recognized that there were things that were in those plans that were out of date. You know, the city's constantly evolving. You know, I think one of the plans we've looked at a lot is the downtown West Gateway area plan. It was done in the mid-aughts. It has some very specific recommendations for height. At the time it was done, Raleigh Union Station didn't exist. The development environment downtown was very different. We've repeatedly breached the height limits in that area plan through various rezonings. And I think because of those actions, it's clear that the council and much of the public is thinking about the area differently than they were in the 2004 framework, time frame. So that's the type of thing that's probably ripe for some revisiting. It's not generally good to have on the books policy statements that you're ignoring, because they're supposed to have again, wait. And if there's a general sense within the community or within the city council that that the world has moved on since those policy statements were written, it's good to update them to reflect that new reality.
Thank you, Mr. Bowers. I'm glad you brought up downtown West Gateway. That was going to be a question I had. I find that one specifically to cause me consternation when we're looking at rezonings in the downtown and in the warehouse district. Were there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Seeing none, I'd like to entertain a motion. Commissioner Haber.
I move to recommend approval of CP 521. Request is reasonable in the public interest and supported by specific policy IM 3.4 amendment criteria.
You, Commissioner O'Haver has offered a motion to approve CP 521. Do we have a second? Commissioner Alder? We have a motion and a second on the table. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanita for a roll call of the vote. At the conclusion of the vote, I will announce the outcome.
Bennett, how do you vote?
Sorry, my mute button is moving of its own free will here. Nay, for the reason that I mentioned.
Commissioner Dartell?
Aye.
Commissioner Elder?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Vice Chair Mann?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Aye.
Commissioner Reynolds?
Aye.
The motion passes 7-1. Okay, moving on, item F.3 was discussed during old business. So we are now at item F.4, case number Z2521. This is a request to rezone approximately 7.44 acres of land from residential 1 with Falls Lake Watershed Overlay Protection District to residential 10 with conditions and the Falls Lake Watershed Overlay Protection District. This request has not been previously discussed, so we will start with a staff presentation from Sarah Ellis.
Good morning, members of the Planning Commission. Rezoning request D2521 is a request to rezone just under 8 acres. And I'll note it's a portion of a parcel, so it's the northern half of the parcel that you see on your screen from R1 with that Falls Watershed Protection Overlay District to R10 with conditions and retaining the Falls Watershed Protection Overlay District. And the Planning Commission deadline for action is October 9th. So as you can see, the zoning in the area, it's a mix. When you go on the sort of western side of Bailiwick Road and going up Six Forks, it's a lot lower density because that's where you can see the protection overlay district lies. And then if you go on the eastern side, there is a commercial area that is much more dense and has sort of variety of shopping uses and things that you'll see in the next slide that shows just kind of an aerial vision of the area. So as you can see, again, the applicant's only requesting to rezone a portion of their site. And if you kind of look around it, on the west side, you have a lot of rural residential. And then, as you saw in that previous slide, that's all in the Falls Watershed Protection Overlay District. And then going a little bit further to the east, it becomes a little denser with the residential. And then there's a shopping center at the intersection of Six Forks and Bailiwick. And then just to the north of the site, that forested area is a Duke utility easement. And then there's a YMCA. And just zooming in a little bit closer on the site, you can see there's a church there today. So the church is being represented by the applicant that's here, and they're seeking to rezone just that rear portion of the site. And again, just showing that there's to the west, rural residential, and then to the east, it's much more commercial uses. A couple of views looking in on the site. So it's a forested site, so you can't see it very far in it, but what you can see is that it's located on some major intersections and it's pretty forested as it is today. So it's kind of a couple different views looking in. The proposed conditions, and again, this is just a summary, so the full text of the conditions is available in the backup, but they would be restricting uses to those permitted in R1, as well as 2-unit and multi-unit living. The apartment building type will mimic the appearance of a townhome, and the residential density is limited to 40 units. Just a snapshot showing you the existing versus the proposed zoning. So the biggest changes you'll see are an increase in the residential density. So it would go from just under 1 unit an acre to just over 5 units an acre. And it would be a difference of, you can do 7 today, and then 40 is by virtue of that cap through the conditions. And then the other notable change would be the setbacks would be decreased on the front side and rear of the site by virtue of the R10 zoning. And then again, sort of showing a similar picture, but the only piece I'll call out in here is the request does not include office or retail, as it's R10, so it would be a purely residential rezoning request. I'll go through these quickly. It's going to get to the meat of the case, but carbon emissions analysis basically shows the walk score is a little bit better, the transit score is a little bit worse than the city on average, and it would permit smaller units than in the R1 zoning district. You can see there is bus service, and there's a sidewalk along Six Forks. So this is, it's under, gosh, it's maybe about a quarter mile south. You can access the bus. It's a busy road to walk down, but it is served by Route 8. As far as affordability analysis, the request doesn't include any subsidized units, but it does add to the housing stock in the area. It's within that bus stop you saw on the previous slide, and would permit smaller lots than citywide average by virtue of the R10 zoning district's dimensional standards. So the request does border on a mixed-use center, and it has an urban thoroughfare designation along Bailiwick Road, but because it's a residential zoning request, this policy really does not apply, since residential R10 does not include the option for a frontage. So just pointing out that's a relevant policy, but does not apply in this situation. A little bit on the demographic and land use history. So just, and also this is detailed much more in the staff report if folks would like to dig into that, but area is less racially diverse, has a higher income, and most folks have higher than a high school education, and staff did not find any documentation of racially restricted covenants on the property. As for a comprehensive plan analysis, it's consistent with the plan overall. However, it's inconsistent with the future land use map designation of institutional. And some consistent policies, and where you see the orange dots, those are just calling out key policies in the comprehensive plan. But essentially what the request is doing is it would allow for more compact development by increasing the residential density and lowering the minimum dimensional sizes for the lots. It would be an appropriate transition zone. As you recall, the site is located between a very commercial area and between low density residential. So this would sort of allow a transition that seems appropriate with these policies, similar with density transition. It would also allow greater housing variety, and it's consistent with the Falls Lake secondary watershed policy. It is inconsistent, however, with the future land use map, conservation of single family neighborhoods, as it would allow uses that are beyond the single family residential. And the inconsistency with that Falls Lake secondary watershed density is simply because the request would allow 5.38 units per acre, and that policy says that the maximum density should be 5 units per acre. So the request is exceeding the density slightly for that policy. Deadline for action, October 9th. No outstanding issues on the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ellis. Next, I would like to hear from Worth Mills, representing the applicant. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, members of the Planning Commission. Worth Mills here with Longleaf Law Partners on behalf of the applicant. We have a presentation as well that we'll be sharing. So if you go to the next slide, please. So a lot of this is information that Sarah went over, but really the purpose of this rezoning is to create a general density transition from the shopping center to our west and the single family neighborhood across Six Forks Road. Property is currently owned by Winborn United Methodist Church on the southern portion. That is not subject to the rezoning. Winborn United is selling this approximate 7.5 acre parcel to be developed for residential uses. The church use would remain as is today. As Sarah mentioned, we are proposing to rezone the property to R10 conditional use with the Falls Watershed Protection Overlay District, where we are limiting the uses to those allowed currently under R1 and 2-unit and multi-unit living. We would prohibit stacked dwelling units, meaning that even if they are sold as a condominium unit, they would appear as traditional townhomes. And lastly, we have restricted development intensity to no more than 40 units total. Next slide, please. So again, this is a big picture of the site. You have the, as I mentioned, the Lowe's Food Shopping Center to our west, and the low density neighborhoods to our east across Six Forks Road. Next slide, please. And similar to Sarah's slide here, you can see the site closer up. That area north of Winborn United is what is subject to this rezoning. As I mentioned, Winborn would retain the southern portion and continue its use as is today. Next slide, please. This is a diagram showing the proposed partition of 9121 East Six Forks Road. As I mentioned, with Winborn retaining the southern portion. It's approximately 7.44 acres, shows the proposed property lines as well as conceptual 40% forestation areas and TCA. Although, you know, the precise areas of those are not set in stone and will be done at the subdivision stage. Next slide, please. So here's the current zoning, currently zoned R1 with the Falls Watershed Protection Overlay District. We have similar zoning across Six Forks Road with various mixed-use zoning districts across Bailiwick Road. And again, just showing that dichotomy of development intensity and uses with Six Forks and Bailiwick serving as the dividing line. We think that by allowing for residential density under 6 units per acre, that would create that smooth transition from your commercial uses over to your traditional single family low density homes across Six Forks Road. Next slide, please. So the site is designated as institutional on the future land use map, and the most corresponding zoning district is either campus or some type of OX. While it's consistent with while our request is consistent with the future land use map, our rezoning request is for a less intense land use than what is contemplated under the future land use map. And you can see again, the future land use map showing those intense uses to our west and to our south with the rural residential uses across Six Forks Road. Next slide, please. So here we have an excerpt of the urban form map. And while we can't include a frontage for this rezoning because it is a residential zoning district, this map, I think, highlights the existing non-residential uses that are within walking distance of this site. And just want to reiterate again that these 40 units would have walkable retail and services across Bailiwick Road, which should save on vehicle trips per day and during peak hours. Next slide, please. So these are the zoning conditions that we have offered. As I mentioned, only those uses that are currently allowed in the R1 zoning district, as well as the 2-unit and multi-unit living would be allowed. Second condition is for the prohibition on stacked units, meaning that units would be divided horizontally to resemble a traditional townhome product. And lastly, no more than 40 residential units are allowed on the property. Next slide, please. This slide shows a conceptual site plan and layout. You see the 40 proposed units along an interior road from Six Forks to Bailiwick, with the proposed forestation, 40% forestation pursuant to the Falls Watershed Overlay, primarily fronting on Lead Mine and some on Bailiwick Road. Again, this is conceptual at this time, and although it's not set in stone, I know that the applicant and their civil engineers have been working on layouts pretty consistently throughout the rezoning process. Next slide, please. And this is an overall concept plan that shows both the subdivided parcel and the Winhorn United Methodist Church parcel. And this is to show that we have done forestation calculations, and both the 7.5 acre subdivided parcel and the remaining church parcel should be able to comply with the Falls watershed 40% forestation requirement. And so just to conclude, the proposed rezoning offers that general density transition from the retail center to our west and the single family neighborhoods to our east. It would allow for additional building types while limiting density to under 6 units per acre. And it promotes walkability by locating homes near existing retail and personal services. For these reasons, the request is reasonable and in the public interest, and I'm available to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. There is no one from the public signed up to speak on this request, so I will open for questions and comments from commissioners. Does anyone have any questions or comments for either staff or the applicant? Commissioner Elder?
Mr. Worth, you mentioned 6 units per acre is what you guys are limiting to, but isn't the proposed zoning 5.38?
Oh, so I think in my conclusion, what I said was that we are limiting density to under 6 units per acre. So we're capping the total number of units at 40, and that density comes out to, as I think Sarah mentioned, 5.38 units per acre. So we would be within the low density residential recommendations of 1 to 6 units per acre.
And what would it have to be to comply with the Falls overlay, Falls watershed? I can't remember exactly what that's called.
Sarah, that's 5 units per acre, correct?
That's correct.
So you would go from 40 to 37, roughly. I'm doing my math right.
So our current conditions are to limit total number of units to 40. And we feel comfortable with that number because it's within that 1 to 6 unit per acre density range that's contemplated by low density residential. And we are just over that recommendation for the Falls watershed of 5 units per acre.
While we have you on the line, can you verify also what the requirements are for that overlay regarding forestation?
Yes, ma'am. So subdivisions within the Falls watershed protection overlay have to comply with the 40% forestation requirement. That's different than your standard tree conservation area requirement. In the Falls watershed, if you don't have 40% forestation, then you have to plant the amount of trees necessary to get you to 40%. Fortunately for this site, it's already heavily wooded, and so I don't expect there to be a need to plant any new trees. It would be a matter of preserving those that are on the site today.
Thank you. Apologies, Commissioner Elder, did you have an additional question?
Yes, sorry, it's probably a bigger question than just this project, but I was curious if they are lower density than the future land use map, but higher density than the Falls overlay. Is that going to continue to be a conflict for everything that falls into both of those patches along this area?
Would staff be able to provide some clarification on that?
Chair Fox, we were briefly conferring on the best staff member to answer that question. Sorry, one moment.
No worries. Commissioner O'Haver, do you have a question while we're waiting?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say while they're conferring, I had some similar lines of thought to Commissioner Elder. So I was also wondering if there was precedent in the area of exceeding the 5 units per acre. And I was curious as well, what would it take to get to 5 units per acre? I think Ms. Elder asked that question, and I'm definitely not good enough at math to figure that out.
While we're looking at that, Mr. Elder had the figure run 37 units, that's 37 unit cap across the 7.44 acres would work out to 30, would work out to just under 5 units per acre. And I'm going to fill the vacuum. I believe the watershed, that the 5 units per acre is a creature of the Falls Lake watershed plan policy as opposed to something that's in the overlay district. So the overlay district sets forth the standards like the 40% forestation and other performance measures. What you're doing is somewhat exceeding a policy recommendation if you were to approve this at 40 units. But if you approved it, then that would be the zoning, and they'd be allowed to build the 40 units. There would not be an internal contradiction between the zoning and the watershed overlay district.
Thank you for that, Mr. Bowers. Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. So, Mr. Bowers, would this be an example of what we were just talking about? If we approve this, approving a rezoning that goes against an area plan, and if it happens enough, then you might go back and revisit the area plan?
It could be an example. I mean, we're talking about if this were twice, if this were 10 units per acre, that would be a very serious deviation. This is a somewhat more modest deviation. We're talking about a 3-unit difference. I think what you would have to weigh is whether or not other conditions attached to this have enough of mitigating effect that you would be comfortable with breaching that density limit. If you're not, then obviously you could either ask the applicant to amend their condition from 40 to 37, or eventually decide to recommend denial of the case based on the inconsistency with that policy. The watershed plan, of course, is intended to do as much as possible to protect water quality. So I think what you have to weigh against is there an adverse water quality impact to allowing this incremental breaching of that density cap of 5 units per acre that's recommended in the plan.
Oh, that was a great segue into the question I originally had, which was, can someone from staff talk about the inconsistency with Greenprint Raleigh?
I'd be happy to speak to that. I'm just going to pull up the portion of the staff report where I could make sure I'm citing correctly. Yeah, high level, the inconsistency with Greenprint Raleigh is that policy is recommending, or I apologize, that vision theme is recommending that Raleigh continue to grow in a sustainable manner. And I believe that would imply following some of the recommendations in that policy. So that's the inconsistency, is that the request is intending on a level of density that was not envisioned by other policies in the area and could be considered less sustainable than if one were following it.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any questions or comments from commissioners remaining? Commissioner O'Haver?
Yeah, can I get a little bit more clarification from staff on the, it's along the urban thoroughfare frontage, but it's not required because of residential. So what impact does that have on the streetscape?
Well, it could lead to not the vision of having a frontage on there. That could be one potential outcome. But I think what you're seeing here is that push and pull of the comp plan, that if it is not possible for all of these policies to be consistent, because what the urban form map is calling for is a level of density that is not being called for by the Falls Watershed Protection Overlay District. So it's sort of I would say a decision point for the commission perhaps as to which policies you feel need to be upheld through this case. But just to summarize that, I think the outcome would be, yes, you would not see a frontage along this portion of the road, and that could lead to less contiguous building types and perhaps less walkability along the road. However, the density is limited, so there's that policy support on that side.
Sarah, this is Worth. We would still be required to complete streetscape improvements along Bailiwick Road. It just wouldn't be pursuant to any specific frontage, correct?
That's right. Yeah. And let me, thanks, Worth. I'll just clarify. Yeah. Basically, the request would not have a frontage in there from that section of the code. They would be required to complete streetscape improvements, but it may not reach the intent of the policy here to have a walkable area. It would just meet basic code requirements.
Did I see an additional hand up for a follow-up question, or Mr. Bowers?
I just want to issue a clarification, going back and reading the staff report and the policy. The actual policy guidance from the area plan is for 4 units per acre, not 5. That would argue for a cap. The consistency with that would be a cap of 30 units.
Commissioner Haber?
Well, then yeah, okay, never mind.
Okay, are there any additional questions or comments? Commissioner Dattell?
Thanks. I guess I don't really have much of a question, more of just a comment. Just that I do have some concerns about exceeding that sort of recommendation there in this instance, unless there's some compelling reason to go beyond that, which I'm not seeing. But thanks.
Commissioner Bennett?
So would the applicant be willing to stick with the 4 units per acre with the cap of, with the cap of 30 units? Seems like that's where most of our concerns are.
I don't believe so, Commissioner Bennett. I think they have envisioned their plan for 40, and we think that that is a reasonable transition from the Lowe's Food Shopping Center, which is commercial mixed use across 6 Forks, to the single family neighborhoods.
Okay, thank you, Worth.
Commissioner Elder?
Are there other, I guess, water quality preserving measures that could be taken to somehow offset the density and going against the 4 units per acre recommendation?
I believe that's a question to the applicant.
This is Janet Boyer with Stormwater staff. I think I can try to answer that, Commissioner. So as far as stormwater is concerned, there are significant requirements under the Falls Watershed Overlay District as far as impervious and treatment for water quality. And so we would expect, our only concern would be that the applicant be able to show they could meet those requirements. And that's not necessarily a density question, but rather an impervious area question and the treatment provided. There are specific impervious limitations in Chapter 9 of the UDO for those that spells out those requirements in the Falls Watershed. And stormwater staff would be looking at that for any development plan reviews.
And this is Worth. I'll note that we have done a lot of land planning and a lot of site layout with the proposed 40 units per acre, and we are showing compliance with the impervious surface. We are showing compliance with the 40% forestation with room for adequate stormwater control measures as well.
Do we have any additional questions or comments from commissioners? I'll offer a brief summary. We have an applicant offering a proposal for 40 units on the site. Some commissioners have expressed concern about the total number of units. Others might be concerned about a housing shortage throughout the city and may want to increase housing opportunities while also meeting the overlay. So we have the option of holding this at the table, although we've heard from the applicant, they're not interested in altering the density as it's currently proposed, or we can vote this forward. What is the will of the commission? Would anyone like to propose a motion? Don't all go at once. If you give me 1 second, I believe I can probably catch up with us. Okay. With that, I offer a motion to approve Z2521. As it is reasonable in the public interest, I move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated September 14th, 2021, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment. This recommendation also includes an amendment to the future land use map to the extent described in the adopted consistency statement. Do I have a second? Okay, seeing none, okay, Commissioner Rains.
Second.
Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask for a roll call of the vote, and at the end of the vote, I will announce the outcome.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Nay. I'm feeling very negative here today. I don't mean to be, but nay.
Commissioner Dartell,
Aye.
Commissioner Elder,
Nay, and I'll say it's mostly because I'm concerned that we're setting a precedent for some of the other parcels that will fall under the same conflict and compromise the water quality Falls Lake.
Chair Fox,
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman,
Nay.
Vice Chairman,
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver,
I'm going to vote aye, but perhaps we need to relook at, per some of our earlier discussions, relook at this particular policy in need of housing and other things in this area. So I'm voting aye.
Commissioner Rains,
Aye.
The motion passes 5-3. Moving on to item F.5, case number Z2621. This is a request to rezone approximately 107.37 acres of land from residential 4, residential 6, and conservation management to residential 6, conditional use and conservation management. The property is located approximately 1 mile from the intersection of Old Milburnie Road and New Bern Avenue. This request has not been previously discussed, so we will start with a staff presentation from Don Belk.
Good morning, Chair Fox, members of the Planning Commission. This case is Z2621. It's several parcels known as the Adcock assemblage and a request to rezone 107.37 acres from R4 to R6 conditional use. Next slide. As you can see, the predominant zoning in the area is R4. Note the Hedingham PD. Across the river to the west. To the east is the 540 West development zoned R6 CU. Presently, there are 277 lots that are platted in that area that is still under construction. An aerial view showing the large cleared area for I-540 West, as you can see there at low density residential and other features, the proximity of I-540. Next slide. And a closer view. Note here the county subdivision to the south and west would adjoin the site at the border. And you can see here a close-up as well of the I-540 West, which would also connect to Old Bill Birdie Road. Next slide. Some images showing the nature and landscapes of the area as it exists now. Next. Also showing this would be proximate to that residential subdivision to the south and west. And also a photo, Pinnacle Peak Drive would be the main connection to the future 540 West development. One condition has been proposed to include a multi-use path that would be built to City of Raleigh standards, subject to PRCR approval. And that is shown in Exhibit A on the following slide. Note the location of the 10-foot greenway, which would adjoin to a 10-foot concrete sidewalk, and the placement of an amenity area at the terminus of the greenway. Proposed zoning, the differences here, note the maximum unit count would increase slightly, and some differences in the setbacks. On our carbon footprint analysis, the proposal being in the far eastern area of our ATJ, expectedly a lower walk score and lower transit score than average. However, the proposal would permit smaller and efficient units. Townhomes would be permitted under this zoning proposal as a result of TC 520. Slide. I noted this slide of bus service. Route 33 Knightdale does go along 64 Business, Knightdale Boulevard. However, this area is about almost 2 miles away from the closest stop. And this proposal does add to the housing supply, and it does permit both detached and attached building types, duplexes, townhomes, and the lots are smaller than the city average. And it's certainly not within walking distance of transit. The demographics and land use history slide, there's an error on the slide. Please ignore that first bullet. As you can see from the chart, the demographic indicators are above the city of Raleigh average, but nowhere near double. That's an error. I would also note that being on the periphery of Raleigh, these parcels have been in agriculture for as far back as records show, and there are no known restricted covenants that would restrict development beyond UDO requirements. The request is consistent with the future land use map designation of low density residential. And it's consistent with the comprehensive plan overall. Note the consistent policies here with the key policies noted with the orange dot. One inconsistent policy was identified. The large site development policy does indicate a note to look at impacts of large site development. This proposal, of course, is a large greenfield site at the easternmost section of the city's jurisdiction. And although the applicant has proposed a condition that provides a community facility, the multi-use path that would provide for a connection to the Greenway network. That does address some of the intentions of this policy. However, staff felt that there were no conditions that would demonstrate specifically how this proposal would support other policy goals of offsetting the impacts of large development, particularly resource preservation through more efficient land use and open space and stormwater management, et cetera. So the one inconsistent policy identified here. Next slide. And there are no outstanding issues on this case, and your deadline for action is November 8th, 2021. That concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Belk. Next, I'd like to hear from Mac Paul representing the applicant. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Chairman Fox, Mac Paul, Morningstar Law Group. I would respectfully ask to defer our comments until after the next companion case, since they really are part and parcel of the same issues. So to be more efficient, we would defer.
Thank you. I will allow and move forward. One member of the public signed up specifically for this case. So if we could unmute any members here to speak in support or opposition.
Yes, I have Lee Ann Hammerbacher.
Hi, yes, this is Leanne Hammerbacher, and I am here representing the adjacent landowners and Triangle Land Conservancy. We hold an easement on the 133-acre tract that sits to the north of this property, known as Beaver Dam Lake. We've been talking with the applicant about potential conditions that I think could help meet a lot of the goals of the comprehensive plan and help ensure water quality of both Beaver Dam Lake and the Neuse River, and just have some concerns with this going forward at this point until we've been able to work out some of those conditions. Our main comment is that thinking about this in consistency with the comprehensive plan, specifically the large lot development and several of the water protection and policies, environmental policies in the plan, specifically thinking about designing with nature and water quality protection, looking at protecting significant resources, natural water features, open space features, public and private development plans, as well as preserving scenic vistas, views, and the greenway system. We feel like there have been conditions made to help support the greenway system, but would really like to work with the applicant to look at the opportunity to set aside a greater habitat corridor and potentially water quality buffer on the northern section of the property. We're hopeful that we can come to a consensus on that, but think it should be something on a property of this size on the very eastern fringe of the Raleigh's area that we're really looking into. The comprehensive plan specifically calls out protection of the Neuse River, and there's very few parcels left of this size and green development potential within the city's jurisdiction. We'd also like for the Planning Commission and staff maybe to look at some of the existing policies that are in place in conversations with the applicant and staff and others. We were hopeful that maybe a conservation subdivision ordinance or rezoning development might be able to go into play, but it does seem like there's a lot of complications with using those ordinances. So we'd like to maybe see if there's ways to work with staff in the city to make conservation developments on properties like this a little bit easier to implement. The current Neuse River buffer rules would only require a 50-foot set aside. And really for habitat protection and water quality, 300 to 1,000 foot buffers are really required. So we're hopeful that maybe we can work with the applicant to provide some additional conditions that will help protect this important wildlife corridor, as well as the quality of the Neuse River and Beaver Dam Lake.
Thank you, Ms. Hammerbarker. Before I move forward, can I just verify with you that you would be able to stay for the next item if we decide to discuss them together?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. With that, I'm going to hold this one at the table to move to the next item. The two cases are adjacent and touching and meant to be the same development upon completion of a rezoning. So with that, I'm going to hold Z2621 momentarily so we can get a staff presentation on case number Z2721. This is a request to rezone approximately 35.14 acres of land from residential 4 and conservation management to residential 6 conditional use and conservation management. This property again is adjacent to the previous case, located approximately 1 mile from the intersection of Old Mill Burney Road and New Bern Avenue. Again, this request has not been previously discussed. I'd ask for a staff presentation from Don Bell.
Thank you, Chair Fox. I will run through these slides rather quickly. If we could go to the next slide, please. Again, predominantly R4 in the area. It is adjacent to Night Dale's ETJ to the south. And another view and a close-up view, a location. Note the proximity of the subdivision to the west, and there would be a connection made there on Pencilwood Drive. Next slide, please. And this shows that junction of Old Mill Burney Road at Pencilwood, and again, the rural landscapes there along Old Mill Burney Road. See also at the bottom left is where that connection of Pencilwood Drive would take place to this particular property. Identical condition to Z26, the development of the multi-use path built to city standards. Next slide. And the exhibit next. Again, R4 to R6CU, note the increase in maximum units and the slight difference in setbacks. The carbon emission analysis replicates that of Z26. Again, closest bus service for this particular site would be over a mile away. And note the same affordability analysis as the previous case. Again, please, and the demographic indicators are also identical. Next slide. It is consistent with the future land use map designation of low density residential and consistent overall with the comprehensive plan. Note the consistent policies here, the key policies noted with the orange dot, and there were no inconsistent policies for this particular proposal. And your deadline for action is November 8th, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Belk. I'm going to shift back to hear from Mac Paul representing the applicant on both Z2621 and Z2721. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Thank you. I'm here on behalf of the Adcock Family Farm and the Simmons Trust. We also have Carlton Midget on the line, who is a trustee for the Simmons Trust and has a long-standing relationship with the Adcock family, so is working in unison on all of these properties. We started out this case with a general use R6 in keeping with the comprehensive plan, just a slight increase in density. have been tracking closely TC 520 for the missing middle because it does create an opportunity for a more variety of housing type, potentially some townhomes, although it's anticipated to be predominantly single family. And this is a much needed area for housing as it's filled in over time. Not being on a transit line, single family and, townhome is more likely housing type at this location. When we got our initial comment letter back from the staff, the comments predominantly were from Parks and Recreation. And we sat down and staff pointed out a great opportunity here. We all, I think most of us use the Neuse River Trail pretty frequently. It's on the west side of the Neuse at this location. However, there is a future Milburnie Park just to the south. And so we came to understand there's an opportunity to have a greenway connection that would take future residents here to the Milburnie Park, and there is a bridge over the Neuse River at that location, so you can access the Neuse River Greenway in a fairly proximate location. Also, potentially in the future, although there's going to need to be some crossings to the north, but by extending the Greenway kind of to the northern edge of these properties, there's a possibility to eventually connect to another bridge as the Neuse River comes back across. The Greenway comes across the Neuse River to the east side, to the north. Parks was very happy with those conversations and the condition that arose out of it. So we did convert it to a conditional use case so that we could make that commitment. Carlton, who I mentioned earlier, has a longstanding relationship with many of the folks in this area. There's the Old Milburnie Fishing Club and the Beaver Dam Lake, and you heard from Ms. Hammerbacher earlier. And we had early conversations, but more recently, last week, we finally got some fairly specific requests from the folks who own Beaver Dam Lake to the north and have certainly indicated a willingness to look at ways to potentially buffer, like have a larger natural buffer along the lake to the north. Just due to the fact we got these yesterday in writing, we would need to, if it's the will of the Planning Commission, to come back to the next meeting with those conditions proffered. But I think the folks have had a very good conversations, productive conversations. I'm optimistic that we can address some of the concerns you heard earlier, and again, add a condition or conditions to that effect to satisfy those concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Just verifying with the moderator, there is no one else signed up to speak on either of these items.
I do have one person signed up to speak on this item.
Okay, let's go ahead. Those in opposition or in support have 10 minutes to speak.
Hello, how's everyone doing? My name is BC Cooper. I'm a resident of Beechwood subdivision, and I've been living here since 1991, so it's close to about 30 years. And I've watched things come, watched them go. Just want to quickly, I won't be in a position where I'm going to be for or against. It just depends. We want to wait and see what happens. But from our neighborhood have been one that's not in the city. It's in the it's ETJ of the city, but it's not in the city. So we are responsible for our own sewer, and we have county water, which is through the city of Raleigh. So we have a lot of things going on there. But the largest thing, and one of the issues that we really need to talk about, is our roads. Our roads have never been retarred. They just trouble roads. Roads just bumpy everywhere. To walk them is really difficult. You got all kind of problems going on with the roads. Now, when you look at those maps that was presented, Pencilwood is going to go directly through that new Z27, I think, whatever that code number was. It's going to put a lot of traffic on those already trouble roads. It's going to be too much to bear. Now, the closest distance to one point is a straight line. People are going to use that. Mr. Adcock made sure that he didn't, that Old Mill Bernie was not a straight road. So when they got ready to run Old Mill Bernie through, they had to go around his property. So that road does a complete S or whatever you want to call it. It's rough right there because it's real difficult for anyone that want to come around there and have to face a car or whatever, opposed to just going straight through a neighborhood. So we're going to get a lot more traffic. But I'm saying we're going to get a lot more traffic dealing with that. Also, we saw some more maps where Pistolwood was going to, as the neighborhood went from Beechwood to the new neighborhood, it was going to be a small elevation right there. It's kind of an incline. I don't know what they're going to do as far as grading it, but we're going to have something in place for retention, our water retention in the area, because it's going to really make our neighborhood have to take on more water. I'm telling you, it's just a bad situation where the neighborhood is not in the city and one is going to be in the city, and they got going to have all good facilities right there, and we're going to have to be the one that's take on the bus at the city, Wake County or the state of North Carolina, Wake County is going to put about probably 2 or 3 bus pickup sites right there in that neighborhood, because they're going to take the safest route as well. So we're going to have more weight on the streets. A lot more things going to be going on in our neighborhood that's going to probably would make it a lot more easier if we could be compatible with them in another way. But like I say, I'm just starting it. I got this thing yesterday, Friday evening, and I kind of looked it over, and I just saw some real big problems as far as with the land purchase or with whoever's going to develop that property. I guess they don't know that yet. I'm sorry. I think I see it right now. Greenway connection. Now, we haven't heard anything about that Greenway connection yet. I mean, that's something new just put on the board. There's some points you can go across the Greenway, but I think it's going to have to, some of them going to be right through our neighborhood. So that's going to, on how the kids going to walk through that Greenway, it's not going to benefit them none, because, we don't have, we got to have more traffic on that road. Kids that's riding the bikes or whatever, probably want to be real careful, because it's going to be kind of difficult to go back and forth, with that much traffic. If I think they're going to put the Greenway where they're going to put it, which is at the front of our neighborhood, which goes right into the Greenway, goes right into the newspaper Greenway. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys for hanging out with me, for letting me talk today, and I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper.
Okay, all right.
Seeing there are no other members of the public signed up to speak, we can pull this to the table and allow commissioners to ask questions of the applicant or staff. I'll start off with a question to the applicant. Mr. Paul, did I hear you correctly that you would be interested in working further with Ms. Hammerbacher and adjacent residents to address some of the comments we heard today?
Yes. The main issue that we've discussed is the kind of where to measure the natural buffer from the southern edge of the lake. And so we've just kind of had some good conversations about it, and just need to kind of come to some resolution on that measurement. We also, I'll just mention, we've had lots of conversations with the Beechwood neighborhood. We understand they've got kind of several issues that aren't really necessarily directly related to this property and this development, in terms of flooding that's coming from the Neuse once that dam was removed, and the fact that they're not in the city and the streets are not maintained by the city. I've had conversations with the transportation department and suggested that they make contact there, and I think there's some potential that the city could possibly take over those street maintenance if that's something the neighborhood desired. So again, we've had a lot of conversation and dialogue over the last 6 months on those issues.
Thank you. Is anyone from staff available to respond to the roadway connection and roadway maintenance as proposed here?
Good morning. This is Ann Conlon in Transportation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Ann.
Okay, sure. In terms of the connectivity and traffic concerns, we hear that. We believe that this connection would generally support access and access to the multi-use trail and the street and benefit the road network. We don't see a lot of traffic diverting to Pencilwood versus going directly to Old Mill Bernie, just based on the layout here. I don't know if anyone else can speak to whether the city could take over street maintenance of Pencilwood. I'm going to defer that to my colleagues. I would assume that we wouldn't take over that street since it's not within the city limits. If anybody else can answer that one, I'd appreciate it.
And this is Eric Lamb from the Transportation Department. Ann is correct. These streets in this neighborhood are maintained by NCDOT, if I'm not mistaken. And we could not take over maintenance unless the area was annexed.
Thank you, Mr. Lamb. Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. So, Mr. Cooper said he wasn't aware of this until Friday. I'm just making sure, Mr. Paul, you did say you've been engaging the Beechwood community throughout this process?
That's correct, but primarily through the HOA, but we've had, at least two I'm trying to think of their in-person. Well, I guess our last meeting was in person. I guess we, because of COVID, we had a virtual meeting prior to that, but we had good participation from Beechwood. Everyone from Beechwood has received those mailings. And Carlton Midget, whom I mentioned earlier, has been out there and met on site with folks that we met at those meetings to talk about further issues. I can't speak to Mr. Cooper's having received or not received some of those prior notices or communications. All I can say is we had a lot of dialogue with that neighborhood.
Commissioner Bennett, this is Don Belk. I just wanted to point out that the condition proposed in this case was not formulated until after the second neighborhood meeting. So that may be why Mr. Cooper was not aware of it.
Okay. So I just want to make sure then, I guess, it sounds like Mr. Paul, you and the applicant will continue your discussions with the neighbors as well as the Beaver Dam organization, so you can discuss some of these issues. And it also, if I understood correctly, so if this is approved, it would be annexed by the city. Is that correct? And that might address some of the road issues that Mr. Cooper was mentioning. Am I correct there?
Yeah, well,
I'm sorry.
This property would be annexed. In my conversation with the transportation, you heard Eric Lamb's comments about the city not taking it over unless it was annexed. So there would need to be a petition by the Beechwood neighborhood separately. But this is in the city's ETJ, the rezoning. So the next step would be a site plan and annexation by the city. And it would have to be constructed to city standards, any streets.
Okay. And then the other issue that was mentioned was flooding. Would this development, I guess the cumulative impact of the two, worsen flooding in the Beechwood community or that area in general?
I might defer to Carlton if you're still on. I know Carlton's had a lot of most of the flooding issues have been coming from the news, not from this direction. But I would like to defer to someone else who may know more about the stormwater.
Mac, I'm happy to try to address that. Am I being heard?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. I'm not an engineer, and obviously the stormwater stuff is technical, but I met out there with a gentleman who had experienced flooding, and we walked the site and I took some pictures. The majority of the flooding is at the extreme southern edge of this neighborhood, and the majority of the water, the vast majority, is coming from across Milburnie Road from the east. There's a large watershed over there. There have been culverts that have recently been improved, and there is a lot of water that comes from the east through their open space. The flooding occurs on the neighborhood open space. There is no evidence that this gentleman could indicate that any flooding reached any lot. But it is true that some of their common area is flooded during a lot of storms. I don't have an understanding of floods from the Neuse. There was a representation that the removing of the dam at Raleigh Beach somehow caused the Neuse to back up into their neighborhood. I don't understand that and can't really speak to it, but the flooding that was discussed by the neighbor adjacent to it was coming from the east, and there's very little water from our site, certainly an almost insignificant percentage of the total water. So without engineering data, we're dropping the bucket compared to the size of the water that's coming from the east, if that's helpful.
Thank you, sir. Is stormwater available to address any of this?
This is Janet Boyer. I am here. I'm sorry I don't have all of that information available, but we would be happy to look into it and report back on that.
Thank you. With that, I'm going to recommend that we hold these two items, Z2621, Z2721, and hear them at a future agenda to allow the applicant additional time to work with the Beaver Dam group and the adjacent neighbors, and also to allow some conversations with stormwater staff. Let me see by show of thumbs up or hands if we are all in agreement of holding these two and moving forward. Okay, excellent.
Chair Fox, excuse me, this is Don Belk. I just wanted to remind all parties that in order to have this case eligible to be reheard on September 28th, any revised conditions would need to be submitted to us by close of business on this Friday. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Going to move on to item F.7, case number Z3721. This is a request to rezone approximately 1.28 acres on Falls of Neuse Road from neighborhood mixed use 3 stories parking limited conditional use and residential 4 to neighborhood mixed use 3 stories parking limited conditional use. This request has not previously been discussed. I'd like to ask for a staff presentation from Ira Mabel.
Good afternoon, Chair Fox and Planning Commission. Ditto what you just said, except to add that your deadline is in November. So we can skip to the next slide. So this case is on the south side of Falls of Neuse Road. The properties all along Falls of Neuse here are primarily commercial. But you can see on both the north and the south side, but you can see behind both of those turns residential, fairly low residential zoning. The water drops on the north side of Falls of Neuse are for the Watershed Protection Overlay District, but the road itself is generally the boundary of that watershed. So those rules do not apply to the south side here. Next slide, please. Just to orient you, so we're about halfway between 540 and Strickland Road on Falls of Neuse, almost directly across from Lafayette Village. Next slide. Big closer view of the site, currently containing the Piper's Tavern Restaurant. There are 2 parcels, so currently 2 zoning districts on the site. The restaurant is zoned already Annex 3, and you can see the boundary line there is about where that east-west buffer yard is planted. And so everything to the south of that is in the R4 district. So next slide. So just a couple photos of the site. That number 1 is the mostly showing the restaurant, and the number 2 there is the lot at the rear, which is currently residential zone. So there are quite a few uses on this case, conditions, pardon me, some of which get sort of complicated. So I will cover them fairly quickly. The first is prohibiting a number of uses. The second is limiting the size of restaurants specifically, or eating establishments. Next slide. Prohibiting drive-throughs and drive-ins, prohibiting restaurants within 100 feet of residential zoning districts. So that would apply to the R4 districts that would remain fronting on Farmingwood Lane. Limiting outdoor events to 4. This is somewhat redundant with current city ordinance. They are allowed that many per year, but this explicitly spells that out and limits the hours of operation of those events. They're applying some special use standards that would be applied to personal service and retail if this district were OX. So personal service and retail are allowed in OX, but they are much more restricted than in NX. So this would apply the OX standards. Prohibiting the siting of trash receptacles from the rear lot line. Prohibiting vehicle access to Falls of Neuse. They currently have 2 curb cuts. And to be frank, I doubt they would be, if they were to come in with a brand new site plan, would be allowed more than 1, but this is limiting them to just their 2. That is mimicking an existing condition anyway. Next slide, please. Number 9 is prohibiting the location of amplified speakers. It is a little bit more complicated in the wording than I've listed here. Number 10 is limiting light poles to a certain size and design. And then number 11 is specifying some of the neighborhood transition options. So in the code, they are allowed 3 type of buffer yard that must be planted and have a fence in some instances. And then also they are allowed certain uses in the transition zone, and they are prohibiting a couple of those: outdoor dining, service area, playgrounds. Next slide. So the change in entitlement here, currently there are no residential uses allowed on the Piper's Tavern lot itself. So that one is under units is really just the R4 lot in the rear. And the case today does not have any restrictions on residential uses. And similarly, you can see the, existing zoning has caps on all commercial uses, and the new one just on restaurant. There is that asterisk in retail, so that retail in an OX district has to be in an office building and is limited to the upper certain percentage of that office building, so that is 15% of the number above it. But really hard to sort of estimate a maximum there. Next slide. So fairly decent walk and bike score. There isn't really transit in this area until you get to Strickland and Falls of Neuse, which is a little bit outside of what we consider our typical walk shed for transit. Next slide. It would add to the housing supply, as I explained before, but again, not really within transit. Next slide, please. And then the no real notable land use history here. This restaurant has been there for quite a few decades now. The median rent has increased, but the general demographics show lower, what we consider vulnerability than the city as a whole. I'd be happy to go into that table should there be questions, but we can go to the next slide now. So the request is inconsistent with the current flume, which is office and residential mixed use, which would namely not allow standalone restaurants or suggest there should not be standalone restaurants or bars, which are allowed in this case. But is consistent with the transit emphasis corridor, so there is a parking limited frontage, which is included here. So despite the inconsistency with the future land use map, it is consistent with the plan overall. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see, all of those conditions I ran through, putting restrictions on the operation did, in my evaluation, trigger a lot of the policies in LU section 5 and 7 about, managing commercial impacts and buffers and et cetera. So is consistent with the plan overall. So next slide is inconsistent policies really are just about the future land use map and what the future land use map says should go here. So next slide, if you do approve it, would trigger a future land use map amendment, neighborhood mixed use, which in this smaller area on Falls and News is generally what's on the north side of the street there. Next slide, and your deadline for action is in November. I will point out here that this case is subject to the recent changes to the zoning process. So the applicant only has one chance to amend conditions. So you do have quite a number of meetings available to discuss it, but only one more revision from their side can be considered here. And I'd be happy to answer any questions at this point.
Thank you, sir. I'd now like to hear from Chad Essick, representing the applicant. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Thank you, Chair Fox and members of the Planning Commission. Chad Essick with Corner Scroll 301 Fayetteville Street, Suite 1900. Here this morning on behalf of the applicant, Piper's Tavern. If we can go to the next slide. Ira's done a nice job kind of summarizing the area, but just to reorient, the area outlined in yellow is the site being rezoned. Across Falls and Noose Roads, you'll see Lafayette Village, some office and a car wash there across, and then to the north of the site is also office, and also to the south is also some office development. This site has been used has been Piper's Tavern for more than 2 decades, over 20 years. And for those of you who maybe grew up in North Raleigh, before that, it was Manchester's restaurant for some period of time. My understanding, the site's been used for commercial purposes dating back to the early 80s when it was once a convenience store. As you can see, next slide, as you can see from the zoning map, the front portion where the restaurant and some parking currently exists is zoned NX3, parking limited conditional use. That zoning was put in place back in 2011 under the prior code when it was neighborhood business, and then it was converted obviously during the remapping process to the neighborhood mixed use designation. As a part of that 2011 case, there were a number of zoning conditions that were placed on that, and most of which we have just carried over verbatim to this zoning case. Just carried over the existing conditions that were on the front portion. The back piece is a landlocked portion that's just over 1/3 of an acre and zoned R4. So really what's driving this rezoning request is the need to provide some additional parking on this site for Piper's Tavern and to rezone that back R4 piece to be consistent with the NX designation to allow some additional parking. If you go back to the aerial slide, there's also, if you've ever been to Piper's Tavern, when you pull in off of Falls of Noose Road, there's parking right there at the entrance. That's not ideal as far as people backing out and people coming in off that 5-lane Falls of Noose. So we want to relocate some of that parking as well, and also provide some additional parking to keep more parking on site. Instead of just rezoning the back portion of the site that's R4 and just putting that in the rezoning case, what we thought was the cleaner and better thing to do was just to rezone the entire site to get one set of clean zoning conditions. The existing zoning conditions on the front portion had a transitional yard that we needed to remove, otherwise it would run right through the middle of our site. So that's why we're rezoning the entire site and creating one set of zoning conditions that will govern the total site. Again, there's no plans to redevelop or further expand the existing restaurant use that's been there for some time. It's really just an opportunity to provide some additional on-site parking. Ira went through a number of conditions that we've both carried over from the existing zoning that's on the front portion, as well as some additional conditions that we've put on after a number of meetings with the neighbors that live to the south, the single-family homes that border to the south. I met with Mr. Zimmerman, who owns the largest lot that adjoins to the south. Before we even had our first neighborhood meeting, walked the site with him. We also had some good conversations at our first neighborhood meeting, our second neighborhood meeting, and we continued to have some discussions about conditions that we could put in place to mitigate some of the impacts from the existing restaurant use. So just to, next slide, please. Next slide. These are all the conditions. I won't go into all of them in great detail, but we did establish a setback for eating establishments from that rear property line that didn't currently exist to help match the intent of the OX standards for eating establishments. We also, next slide, please. One of the requests that came from the neighbors was desire to limit those temporary or special events to no more than 4 per year. We also restricted the hours, as you can see there. We don't have a lot of temporary events at Piper's. We haven't had one in some time, but we have had things like, breast cancer fund. Most of them are charity events for breast cancer awareness or other things that we've had out there, but we are adding this condition to limit those. One of the, we've also had some outdoor speakers that were on the back of Piper's Tavern that are rarely used and are at a low volume, but we've agreed to remove those as well as a part of our zoning conditions. And then also have conditions on, no outdoor dining service located to the rear of the restaurant, which we don't currently have, but we wanted to make that clear that we're not planning to do that in the future. So really the last kind of item that's outstanding that we've had a lot of discussion on over the past couple weeks is the fencing in the transitional yard. There is an existing 6-foot fence that runs along the back property line that was installed back in 2010 or 2011 as a result of there were some people that lived in the neighborhood behind that would leave Piper's and walk through some of the neighbors' yards, and so we agreed with the neighbors at that time to put up that 6-foot fence that kind of runs along the back property line to prevent that. We intend to keep that fence in place, and then we had proposed an 8-foot wooden fence along that back property line as well, in addition to that, and committing to a type 2 protective yard. The neighbors did some research and had asked us to consider some newer technology that's called AcoustiBlock, which is some sound matting that you can put on fencing to help mitigate sound. If you go to the next slide. Oh, sorry. Well, this will show you some of the existing conditions. It's really nice built-up vegetation back there. Next slide. That runs along that back property line. That's the 6-foot fence I was telling you about. Next slide. And so we looked into the AcoustiBlock fencing that they had requested that we look at. And while it is a little bit more expensive than we had wanted to do, we have committed to utilizing that. The only challenge is that it is typically attached to chain link fencing, which is not approved in the transitional yard unless you get alternative fencing materials approved, which we have met with Alicia Taylor in Development Services and explained why we think this fencing could be equal to or better, and have agreed to use a vinyl black coated chain link fence, as well as this AcoustiBlock material, as well as some evergreen trees in that transitional yard to help further screen the fencing. So with that, it's my understanding that the planning is okay with this alternative fencing being put at the back property line. We do need to revise the zoning conditions to put this all on paper as far as this fencing requirements. So we would be asking that the commission defer this case so that we can revise the conditions and put that into the conditions this fencing materials. So I spoke with Mr. Zimmerman, who's kind of been the spokesperson for a lot of the neighbors yesterday, and I think they're appreciative of our efforts. We're appreciative of them continuing to have an open dialogue and talk. And as my understanding, with these conditions getting revised with this fencing, that they do support the case. I believe Mr. Zimmerman, I don't know if any other neighbors are here to speak, but I believe he is on the line to speak. I will want to reserve. I know Cole Rimmer, who owns the office building to the north. I know he had signed up to speak in favor, so I want to give him a minute or so to speak, and I see it's down to a minute and a half. So I'll turn it over to him, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, we have Cole Rimmer.
How are you doing? Good morning. Good morning, Madam Chairman and members of the Planning Committee. My name's Cole Rimmer, and Mike Preston and I own the office condominium north of this site at 8320 Falls the Neuse Road. I'd like to speak in favor of rezoning for a number of reasons. First, allowing the rear portion of the property to be rezoned in order to accommodate some additional parking for the existing restaurant is an excellent idea and would keep more of the parking on site and not on the side streets or anything. All the additional parking will require stormwater measurements to put in place on this property, which would further help control the stormwater flow across the property and adjoining properties. In reference to the stormwater, I have spoken to the owner of Piper's Restaurant about working together to coordinate a stormwater piping such that it goes across my property and ties into the city's water system that's just been installed. Finally, approving this rezoning would provide for more enhanced fencing, as we've been discussing, and buffer that current existing. I have a good relationship with Pipers. We have agreed on what we can do if it's approved by y'all, and I have a good neighbor in him. For that reason, I would recommend that we approve Z3721, and I appreciate the time.
Thank you, sir. Are there any additional members of the public signed up to speak in support, Mr. Moderator?
No, that was the one.
Okay.
Two in opposition.
Are there any signed up to speak in opposition?
Yes, we have two. The first one would be Ellender Mills.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I live at 8005. My property joins the office building that Cole Raymer owns. That was rezoned in 1997. I have lived here since 1980. We have a community dead zone, so to speak, to join my property and his, which is 30 feet with nothing but vegetation on it. So parking is not right up on my back door. The other concern I have today is R4 joins 3 residents on a 1-block street of 8 houses, and everybody else but us has the rezoning as office and institute behind them. A corner of my lot, which is on the corner of Farmingwood and Rainwood, is about 30 feet, maybe 40 at the max. Why shouldn't it be continuous from what my property already has joining it, be the same continuing for the next 2 neighbors, which everybody else on the street and anything on south of Falls of Neuse has, or no, it's excuse me, OX 3PLCU zoning, not the restaurant use. The other factor, offices and institutes are 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. The restaurant is, well, let's say 7 to midnight, 7 days a week, which creates more noise and less enjoyment for my backyard. Thank you, and I appreciate what you're doing.
The next speaker is Jonathan Zimmerman.
Hello, Commission members. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. My name's Jonathan Zimmerman. I live at 8001 Farmingwood Lane, which is the property that borders the south side of the R4 lot in question. I have lived here for about 6 years now with my wife and young children, and we have been going back and forth with Mr. Essick and the applicant to come to some agreeable terms on how we could make this rezoning work for us. When I signed up for this meeting, I signed up in opposition. That was prior to me receiving some additional zoning conditions from Mr. Essick that he detailed at the end of the meeting, or the end of his presentation, which will include this acoustic block fencing. So although I signed up in opposition at this point, I'm willing to support the project as it stands with the revisions that we've requested. Ray, you can leave the slides up. I do want to speak to that content nonetheless. Thank you. I just want to point out a couple of things about the future land use map and the existing standards that are in place, which Ellender referenced. As she mentioned, office mixed use is what is done on every part of the property around us, and that was something that we wanted to have consistent with what is today, but we understand that's just not what's in place, and it doesn't make sense to change to office mixed use given the way that Piper's operates our business. But I want to be clear that it isn't consistent with office mixed use as the way that the staff report had originally stated. If you can go to the next slide, you'll see on eating establishments in office mixed use, a bar, nightclub, and tavern and lounge are not allowed to run their business on an office mixed use lot. And then eating establishments also has to be attached to a business, but more importantly, they're restricted to operate between the hours of 6 a.m. and 11 p.m. and Piper's is open until 2 a.m. every night of the week. So if you go to the next slide, this is why we've kind of requested this fencing material. I've done some research and I have some family that work in the development business. They have been working with sound engineers in the past in highly dense residential areas and have stood by this product. I know we have since talked, or Mr. Essex has talked to the planning group and come up with some approvals around the fencing materials. And we are requesting that this fence be built at the maximum 9-foot high fence, and that it does not disrupt the existing vegetation that Chad had showed on the previous slides. We do have a nice buffer, at least visually, there today, but with the addition of more parking and more people, we're very concerned about the sound. We want to make sure that whatever is built will protect us from the noise and the other disruption that comes with the operation of the restaurant. So that's my bit. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'd now like to allow for questions and comments from commissioners. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. I just have a quick comment, and I just want to commend the applicant. It sounds like there is an extensive amount of engagement with the community, and we see that reflected not only in the conditions that we have here, but also in the last speaker, Mr. Zimmerman, saying he was initially opposed, but after working with the applicant, he now can support this. And this is how engagement should work. And it would be nice if this were more the standard and not the exception. So I just want to appreciate the applicant and the community for working together on this one.
Thank you, Commissioner Bennett. I have a question for the applicant team. I did hear you correctly. You would request additional time to be able to submit the conditions you spoke to with the neighbors? Is Mr. Essex still on the line?
Sorry, yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I just got unmuted there. Yes, Chair Fox, we would like some additional time. I think my goal is we actually worked on drafting these conditions yesterday to send those over to the neighbors to take a look at so that we can hopefully submit those by Friday and be back before you on the 28th. So yes, we would like the additional time to do that.
Okay, excellent. Are there any additional questions for staff or the applicant while we have them on the line? Seeing none, I'm going to recommend we hold this case to allow the applicant to submit those additional conditions. And then I will do a quick check for those that have hard stops. Generally, we have a hard stop at 12:30. It's currently 12:34. I'm going to recommend that the additional cases on the docket today, which include Z4621 and Z4821, we're going to have to hear at another Planning Commission meeting. And we may need to look at scheduling special meetings to be able to work through our backlog. Let me just get some acknowledgement, unless you want to just strap in for the rest of the day. Okay. So I'm going to do that. Stop discussions on the cases today, but go ahead and move forward to approval of the minutes. Does anyone have any comments or questions on approval of the minutes?
I was going to make a motion to approve.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Oh, motion to approve minutes dated, I don't have the date, but last commission meeting in August.
Thank you. Do we have a second? Commissioner Elder? Excellent. We have a motion from Commissioner Mann, a second by Commissioner Elder. I believe we can show of hands on this, Mr. York, if you can give me a thumbs up. Excellent. By show of hands, those in support of approving the minutes? Any opposed? The motion passes unanimously. Okay, I'm going to move on to see if there is a report from the members and then a report from the Deputy Director. Do any members have a report, or would you like to discuss further any displeasure with previous items today? Commissioner Reins.
Thanks, Chair Fox. No displeasure. I just wanted to throw something out for discussion. And we can talk about it at a later date, but I keep seeing a recurring concern about massing and zoning setbacks on tall buildings related to adjacent properties, primarily residential. So I wonder if there was an opportunity to require the applicant to provide, as part of the application, a set of drawings that provides kind of like the 1916 Daniel Burnham zoning massing sketches that he did, just to identify what the building in its proposed form would look like in the maximum case relative to adjacent properties, whether it's cross sections or a simple massing model through SketchUp or other means, or buildings over 12 stories. And I just feel like that would be helpful for us to identify any concerns with massing and transitions. I think for me personally, it's a visual help. I'm a visual learner. So just wanted to throw that out for conversation.
I think that's an excellent comment. If it's a will of the commission, what I'd recommend is we maybe put that item on a committee of the whole agenda for further discussion. Okay, I'm seeing some nods. I'm gonna go forward with that. Do any other commissioners have any comments before we move on? Commissioner Lampman?
I just wanted to pose the comment that I think we have strategic planning tentatively scheduled for next week, but I know we've wanted to kind of look at members in attendance. So I'm open to feedback on that. We do have two guests that are scheduled to speak, but if we need to reschedule, we might want to look at doing that.
I'm going to ask if staff can follow up for us over email. Okay, I'm getting a nod from Mr. Bowers. Okay, any additional comments today? Nope. I'm going to move on to report of the Deputy Director. Mr. Bowers?
You have the written report, so I won't go through it. I'll just highlight a couple things.
You did get your time extension on Z6820. You now have a new deadline of November 19th to take action on that case. A couple text changes coming your way, one on standards for play sets and similar accessory structures. Another one to allow corner stores in residential districts R4 through R10. And then lastly, I know there was a discussion at past planning commission meetings about a racial equity update to the comprehensive plan. That was a funded item in this year's budget, and the RFQ was released on August 30th. So that'll be something that will start later this year.
Excellent, thank you. Is there anything else for the good of the order? No? Then that concludes this meeting of the Planning Commission. Thank you all.